Thank you, Marion. On my flight over here, the flight steward said over the loudspeaker, just after we landed, he apologised for the bumpy landing. He said the captain wasn't at fault. He said the co-pilot wasn't at fault. He said it was the asphalt. I fault two people for being here because back in 2001 I was actually a full-time professor earning a salary at American University in Washington DC teaching international peace and conflict resolution. So I had a career in a field that had many perks. For anyone who teaches at a university, there are many perks there. And so I certainly felt that that was a career that I was well suited for and was looking forward to. But in May of 2001, this chap by the name of Dr. Stephen Greer, I guess many of you have heard of him, decided to organise a press conference with 21 whistleblowers. And so when I saw that, it was like, you know, a bell being struck, a big loud bell in my head that said, this stuff you need to look at. And so I began to look at it, and after doing about 18, 20 months of due diligence, doing my own research, found out that everything that those people were saying in that Disclosure Project press conference about extraterrestrials, UFOs and a government cover-up was absolutely real, that there was no embellishment, there was no deception, that this was very real. And so I decided that I would make that my primary area of research. Now, for some people, that maybe is not a big deal, but for an academic, it's a big deal because basically I became unemployable. And so that was the beginning of my path. You know, they say life on the bleeding edge. I think that's pretty much an accurate description of how things turned out for me. And so I definitely, you know, life took on an interesting path. I was working in Washington, DC, and in 2004 I landed in Hawaii and met this gorgeous woman that for some reason fell in love with me and decided that I would stay in Hawaii. So I thought, well, that's fantastic. So things worked out pretty well in that regard. And then back in 2015 there was another event, another significant development in my research was this gentleman by the name of Corey Goode. Now, I guess many of you have heard of... How many of you have heard of Corey Goode? If you just raise your hands. Okay. Well, more than half of you. Well, I think you probably have watched his Cosmic Disclosure series with David Wilcock. And when I got in contact with Corey Goode back in March of last year, 2015, you know, I had a bunch of questions, a whole lot of questions, so I'd email him my questions and he'd very kindly emailed me back his responses, and so we had a kind of to and fro for several months. And the things he told me were just, really kind of answered a lot of questions I had, because I've been working in international politics since essentially 1989. So, you know, that's kind of like 27 years now, trying to understand what's really going on in international politics. You know, what is it that drives international conflict? Why is it that the world is so messed up? Why don't we have world peace? Why is it so elusive? All of these questions go back to, you know, my studies in a PhD program, and at University of Queensland actually was where I did my PhD in this field of international conflict resolution. And so I was seeking answers to those questions, and of course in 2001 Stephen Greer came in and disrupted my life by opening up this whole issue of extraterrestrials and UFO cover-up, so he opened that up, and so how was I to reconcile these two things? And what I found with the Corey Goode revelations, because I think that's what they are, a really profound set of revelations about what's been going on in our history, that helped me put together the jigsaw puzzle, the big jigsaw puzzle. I mean, not that it's 100% resolved, but it gave me a framework for understanding the big picture. What is really going on with UFOs? What is going on with the cover-up? What is happening with extraterrestrial life? all of those bits, all those bits and pieces that different contactees talk about, different whistleblowers talk about, and all of the evidence and the leaked documents, all of these things point to a really vast, complex jigsaw puzzle. And it's always a challenge trying to put that together. So someone like Corey comes along, and for a researcher like myself, he's gold, because he helps us put together all of the pieces that previously were disparate, and it was hard to kind of connect them. Now I have a much better way of understanding how it all comes together. So what I'm going to do now is give you my understanding today in the lecture in terms of how these secret space programs evolved. You know, what were the beginnings of these space programs, and how do they develop over the years, especially in the United States, which, as everyone knows, is the world's preeminent power, the only superpower at the moment. And of course, what happens in the United States influences the rest of the planet dramatically. So the evolution of a secret space program in the United States, and how that impacted countries like Australia, who are major allies. Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, they're all part of this grouping of nations, the echelon nations, and they cooperate in the national security arena extensively. So it's not just that things happen in the United States and that's it. It's like the United States and the corporations and the military organisations and departments and agencies, intelligence agencies, they also cooperate with their allies in Britain, Australia, Canada and New Zealand. So, so that's what we understand about the role of the United States and its major allies. So I'll be focusing on that for today. And so let me begin by what I think is a very helpful way of understanding the origins of secret space programs in our era. And I'm going to see if I can put the mic here. And hopefully that works and you can hear me okay. So this is where I think we actually have a useful way of understanding how all this began. The origins of NASA and the secret space programs. We look at former Nazi scientists, and this is, as everyone knows, is documentable facts that the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union after the Second World War basically divvied up, conquered Germany, the defeated Nazi Germans, and divvied up their scientists and their technical resources, and you have to, and relocated them to their home countries. And so you have to ask yourself, why would the victorious powers during the Second World War have any interest in the scientists of a defeated power? Why? Why would that happen? I mean, you would think that the ones responsible for the victory of the Allied powers were Allied scientists. So why would they need German scientists who basically were part of the losing team? What did they have to offer? That's the big question. What did they have to offer? Well, clearly all of those major powers believed that these Nazi scientists had a lot to offer. That even though they were part of the losing side, that their expertise, their knowledge of advanced technologies were very, very valuable. And they were willing to break the rules. I mean, in the United States, and probably the same thing for Britain, many of these Nazi scientists were ardent Nazis. Some of them were war criminals. I mean, they worked in underground facilities that worked slave labour to death. These people that later on rose to public prominence, they were directly involved or directly implicated in the abuses of slave labour in underground construction facilities in Germany and other parts of occupied Europe. But nevertheless, the US military felt that even though these Nazis had blood on their hands, some of them, not all of them of course, but some of these Nazi scientists had blood on their hands, nevertheless they were valuable. They had insights into advanced technologies that the United States could not afford to let go. And so they arranged to bring them in. So in the United States there were roughly 1,500 that were brought in. Now, a significant number of them ended up in places like Fort Bliss, Texas, which is where the US rocket program, the US military, the Army in particular, were involved in building a rocket program. And as we know, the Germans were the first to develop rockets as an offensive weapon during war. The V-1 and V-2 rockets were used against Britain, and they were actively planning on developing more powerful rockets to be used against the United States. They hoped to send these over the Atlantic to New York City and other areas. That was the goal, and nevertheless, even though they failed in that project, they still had developed a lot of expertise in ballistic missile technologies, and so the scientists were brought over to the United States. And here you have during the Second World War, Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, General Dornberger, these leading Nazi scientists, really showcasing the V-2 rockets to the general staff of Nazi Germany, believing that these rockets would turn the tide of the war. And so there you have a picture of some of these scientists just displaying what they had done. So we know that their breakthroughs in ballistic rocket technologies was pioneering. And what is it that ballistic rocket technology is based on? Very simple Newtonian physics, Newton's third law: for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So with a rocket, you have a rocket sitting on a launch pad, and the rocket has a certain amount of mass. So it sits on the launch pad, and in order to move that mass, you have to eject mass out at an incredible velocity in order to propel the rocket up and forward into the atmosphere or up into space. And so basically it's very conventional Newtonian physics, where for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you eject gases, if they explode out of the exhaust at an incredible velocity, then that's going to propel the rocket forward. So that's kind of the very simple principle behind Newton's third law. And so the Nazi scientists were experts in this. But that wasn't all that they were experts in. They were experts in something else, another way of doing physics that was pioneering. Now, some of you probably are familiar with the Nazi bell, or Die Glocke, as it's referred to. And this is a very different way of being able to propel things forward. Rather than using Newton's laws of physics, of ejecting mass or rocket fuel at an incredible velocity, the Bell experiments was trying to develop a different way of doing things, using high energy plasma that was pressurized to very high temperatures and pressure, going around very rapidly in a circular path. So you see there with the Bell, you have a kind of circular path down there where you could have something like plasma being conducted in some kind of experiment. So the Nazi Bell kind of suggests that there is another form of physics, and people give it different names. Torsion field physics is a name that has become more popularized, and I think that kind of accurately describes what some of the Nazi scientists had understood, that if you are able to accelerate plasma at high speed, then you're able to generate a torsion field effect. So there you have some of the ideas in this rotating plasma. One of the things that was observed for those that have done this research is that it has an effect on weight or mass. So, you know, remember that rocket standing on the launching pad and having a certain mass and needed to be propelled forward? Well, if you could reduce the mass of that rocket significantly, then you would need less rocket fuel coming out the back. I mean, that's the simple principle. So, of course, conventional rocketry today try to come up with new alloys to reduce the weight of the rocket, the principle being that, well, with less mass, less fuel would be needed and you could get the rocket up there more quickly. Well, so this is something that was observed to have an effect on mass, that rotating plasma around can reduce mass by as much as 97%, which is an incredible figure that some of the people who have been doing research in torsion field physics have asserted. And as I'll discuss a little bit later when it comes to some of the pioneering anti-gravity craft, that 97% seems to be the amount of mass reduction that occurs when you use this principle for some of these anti-gravity vehicles. So spinning plasma around has an effect on mass. Now, how do we know that some of these Nazi scientists were experts in this kind of thing? We know that they were experts in plasma and also in another field, a related field called electrogravitics, or where you generate high voltage charges, electrostatic charges, on one end of an object, kind of like a capacitor. Like if you create a capacitor and one charge is very highly charged, then what was observed by Thomas Townsend Brown in 1928 was that this created a force. Again, this is non-Newtonian because it's not predicted by Newtonian physics, but if you have enough of a high enough electrostatic charge, it creates this force that can propel the whole object forward. So if you think of a capacitor, or like you have here, an object, one end is positively charged and the other end is negatively charged, then the object, the whole thing, will move in the direction of the positive charge. So that's the principle that Thomas Townsend Brown, back in 1928, so this is not new. We're talking about things that were happening almost 90 years ago. 90 years ago that this was understood by scientists back then. And we know that some of the Nazi scientists taken over as part of Project Paperclip, some of those were experts in this. One of them was Winifred Schumann. He was a professor at the Technical University of Munich. He was the director of the Electrophysical Laboratory beginning in 1924 all the way back to 1961. Of course, there was an interruption during the war. But his expertise was in high voltage electrostatics and rotating high energy plasma. So he was an expert in these non-Newtonian propulsion systems. Now, how do we know that this was something that the US was actively researching with the aid of Nazi scientists? Well, we know that Schumann was on a list of Nazi scientists that was actually requested by the US Army Air Force back in 1946. The US Army Air Force was the precursor to the United States Air Force that was formed in September 1947. And so there you have a document with Schumann's name on this document, which was a document basically requesting this group of Nazi scientists to go to Wright-Patterson Airfield, which is where the Air Force conducted its aerospace projects. So why would the US Air Force be requiring Nazi scientists with an expertise in high rotating plasma physics and electrostatics? And this is one of the things that is very powerful evidence that the US, back in the 1940s was very active in researching principles that could be used in the development of flying saucers or something related to the Nazi bell, as we just saw before. So let's now move to NASA and what NASA was doing with conventional rockets. As we know, NASA has used a number of rockets for launching satellites and launching missions into orbit around the Earth, and then orbit around the Moon, and then finally the lunar landing, needing larger and larger rockets. And of course, there's Wernher von Braun, one of those Nazi scientists brought over by Project Paperclip. And von Braun believed very much in rocket technologies, that he believed that rockets was the path to developing a permanent presence in space. So this was a man who was completely committed to rocketry. And so he believed, for example, back in 1952, that you could build a space station using rockets to launch equipment up there into space, and that this could then be assembled in space and it would become a space station. Now, of course, we know this because we know that this is very feasible because this is precisely what happened with the creation of space stations by the Soviet Union and the United States in the 1980s, and more recently with the International Space Station. And similarly, the Chinese are doing something along the same lines with theirs. But it's interesting that back in 1952, this was what von Braun believed was possible. And he wasn't alone. The US Air Force, along with a newly created agency called the National Reconnaissance Office, it was created in this era, around 1960, 61, around that time period. It was created, but it was a secret agency, kind of like the NSA, or National Security Agency, was created in 1952, and it wasn't, I think, until the 1990s that it was officially revealed to exist. Well, the National Reconnaissance Office was formed in the beginning of the 60s, and it partnered with the US Air Force in this project of creating a manned orbiting laboratory, where the idea was that they would train scientists as part of the NASA program, but the military, the astronauts that were going to be trained as part of the NASA program, some of them would go into NASA, into the various projects that they had, but some of the other astronauts would go into this secret program that was being organised by the US Air Force and NRO to create a permanent manned laboratory in space, a space station, that would act as a means of being able to monitor the Soviet Union and other countries of the world. So here we're talking about a secret space station whose real purpose was to spy on the United States and whoever. Now, the history of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory was that in 1963, it was announced by Lyndon Johnson, and then in 1969, there was an announcement that the Manned Orbiting Laboratory was going to be discontinued, and that there no longer would be an attempt to establish a space station for espionage purposes, because satellite technology was supposedly a lot cheaper. So that was the justification given back then. But a lot of people have asked, well, was that it? I mean, was there a military space station secretly put up there? A lot of people have suspected that maybe they did put something up there after all, because the Manned Orbiting Laboratory basically used a Gemini capsule. That's the rocket you see there, the Gemini, which was part of the Gemini space program. Nothing really too advanced, but did the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office develop a more powerful form or a more advanced space station that they planned to put up there in space using whatever means they could. Well, you know, that was speculation, but I think we got an answer to the question, well, does the military have a secret space program or a space stations orbiting the Earth by no less than President Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan said in 1985, in his diary entry, in the Reagan diaries, he said, quote, "Lunch with 5 top space scientists. It was fascinating. Space truly is the last frontier, and some of the developments there in astronomy, etc., are like science fiction, except they are real. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people." Well, this was said in 1985. Well, in 1985, could the US orbit 300 people in space? Well, that's kind of a bit of a mystery. At that time, you had the space shuttle that began operations in 1981. And the space shuttle could certainly, and there were only 5 space shuttles built. And the space shuttle had a crew of 9. Okay, so you've got a crew of 9, you've got 5 space shuttles. Now you do the math. How are you going to get 300 people in orbit using 5 space shuttles with a crew of 9? It's not possible. Where are they going to take them? You're going to just kind of leave them up there inside of a inside of a little satellite up there? No, this is very clearly, Reagan was suggesting that there was some orbiting vehicle up there that could accommodate 300 astronauts. So Reagan answered the question, what happened after the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office cancelled the manned orbiting laboratory mission? They didn't cancel it because they didn't believe that a permanent spy space station wasn't economically feasible. They cancelled that because they had a more advanced program, a more advanced space station that they could put up there. And it was done secretly. It was run by the US Air Force and the NRO. So I think what Reagan was telling us is that this is what's going on. Now, this was the Spider space station concept back in 1976. So either something like this was developed or some other kind of permanent manned space station was created up there that was under the jurisdiction of the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office. Okay, so you've got a space station up there that possibly could accommodate 300 people, as Reagan says. Okay, so then, as we said, this space shuttle, 5 of them take up 9 people at a time. How are you going to get 300 personnel back and forth if this space station exists? So if that does exist, which I think it does, and whistleblowers actually have come forward and said that yes, there are cloaked space stations, cloaked, hidden, that operate in near-Earth orbit or certainly orbiting around the Earth at some altitude out there, several thousand miles or more. So there is something, or maybe more than one, out there. So how are you going to get astronauts up there? Well, it can't be the space shuttle. That's kind of very public, and even though there were a few classified military missions, the number of astronauts going up was always not generally announced by NASA. So there had to be another delivery system. There needed to be other craft going up there. So what were they? Well, this is where we get Edgar Fouche coming forward and revealing back in 1998 what he had learned while he was working at Area 51. Edgar Fouche was an employee at Area 51. His expertise was in avionics. And in 1998, he came forward with a book and also gave a speech, a presentation at the Laughlin International UFO Congress in Nevada. And the name of his book was Alien Rapture. And so he came forward to reveal what he had learned. And here he had a lot of documents to substantiate that he genuinely was an expert in avionics, that he knew about the avionics systems of advanced jet craft that were being built by the United States, and his documentation support his claims that he was working at Area 51. He said that he also was collaborating with 5 other people, 5 other peers that worked with him out of Area 51 on related projects, other advanced aerospace programs, and that they collectively pooled their knowledge together to see what the big picture was, because as many whistleblowers reveal, classified programs are typically compartmentalized. So you might work in something like avionics, another person might be working on something like propulsion, another person working on another related area, navigation. And typically the way in which these classified programs work, especially at Area 51, is people don't talk about what they're doing to one another. They don't share knowledge, which is very different to what happens in a university where scientists share information all the time, which is where a lot of science in the white world makes great advances, because science and knowledge is shared and discussed amongst peers who can kind of like go over any problems anyone has. So that's how science is typically seen to advance. But in these classified programs, a very different principle is used, one of compartmentalization, where scientists can't talk about what they're working on, or engineers can't share it with others. So nevertheless, Fouche says that he and his 5 buddies, during their off hours, nevertheless did share this information. And that Fouche was tapped by this group of 6 people working out of Area 51, that Fouche would be the one that would come forward and reveal what was going on. So now we're going to hear, now we're going to see what it was that Fouche said was happening at Area 51. That might give us an answer to what are the delivery systems for these space stations, cloaked space stations that are being run by the NRO and the US Air Force. So Fouche talked about the Aurora project, which is the replacement for the SR-71. That's the Blackbird that became operational in the early 1960s. The Blackbird has a top recorded speed of 2.5 Mach, 2.5 times the speed of sound, and that's supposed to be the official record for travel. Now, Fouche said that the SR-74 and SR-75 that are part of this Aurora project can fly much, much faster than that. These are hypersonic vehicles. Hypersonic is anything over Mach 5 times the speed of sound. So the Aurora project involves 2 craft. The SR-75 is the larger of the 2 craft. So that can reach speeds, according to Fouche, of Mach 5. And the smaller craft is the SR-74, and that's capable of achieving speeds that enable it to go into orbit, low Earth orbit. And so what's interesting here is you can have the insignia for the SR-75, the US Air Force, and there you have the insignia for the logo for the NRO. So both of those organisations, military organisations, cooperate very closely together in this project. So the SR-74, SR-75, there you have using some of the technologies from different corporations, the Rockwell Corporation, and these are really the one of the most advanced or most highly classified projects out of Area 51, according to Fouche. Now, Fouche says that there is another craft that is even more powerful, more advanced than the Aurora project vehicles. And this, he gave it the name, the TR-3B, also known as the Flying Triangle, or sometimes also known as the Locust. This is the US Air Force top secret, nuclear-powered, and there you see some of the design specifications for this craft. Now, notice how you have at the very bottom of it, you have the plasma mercury accelerator ring, magnetic field disruptor. That's what that's the name of it, given by Fouche. And here you have mercury plasma circulating at speeds of 60,000 revolutions per minute. Well, your car engine, I think many cars, I mean, your maximum speed is around 6,000 revolutions per minute. Maybe a little more for more high-end cars, but certainly typically 6,000 revolutions. And when we're kind of traveling normally, it's around 2,000, 3,000 revolutions. So this is 10 times more, 10 times faster. And this is where you get the gravity cancellation effect, or the mass being reduced significantly, that, according to Fouche, with this spinning plasma down there, it creates a torsion field effect. And everything within the field created by this spinning plasma is reduced by 97%. So this is where we are talking about a craft which really is employing non-Newtonian physics now, because it can do things that defy conventional physics. Because now the mass of this craft, because in the Newtonian world, mass is a constant. Gravity can change, the gravity on the Earth, the gravity on Mars, the gravity on the Moon, these things change, but your mass is going to determine your weight on Earth. So your weight on Earth, which is dependent on your mass, isn't going to change because you're on Earth. But with this technology, with this torsion field created by the spinning plasma, your weight changes, which is impossible under traditional Newtonian physics because mass is constant on the Earth. So the mass changes, the weight changes, and that means that now you're 97% larger. Everything in that craft has a mass which is only 3% of what it originally had. And that means that it can accelerate very, very quickly using conventional propulsion systems. So here you have, it's a nuclear-powered triangle, so you have 3 engines. So these can be powered either by nuclear weapon technologies, have been used extensively as a means of powering craft. Now, we're not used to nuclear-powered aircraft because officially the US Air Force stopped that in the 60s and 70s. And I know, though, many of you are aware of Stanton Friedman, and he was actually employed for some time in developing a nuclear-powered aircraft, but the US Air Force said it was too risky, and so they abandoned that project. But nevertheless, the US Navy went ahead and built nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. So nuclear power is used as a stable form of propulsion for aircraft carriers. Same thing applied to this TR-3B using nuclear power. So that means you've got this mercury plasma spinning around in the center that reduces the weight of the craft, and then you have the nuclear engines kicking in, and that can propel the craft forward very, very rapidly. So we're talking about speeds way in excess of hypersonic, 5 times the speed of sound, it being capable of going into orbit around the planet. So that's the physics of the TR-3B, and that's something that, according to Edgar Fouche, is the most highly classified secret at Area 51. And in fact, Area 51 has 2 facilities. One is the less classified facility at Groom Lake, where you have the Aurora project, the SR-74, SR-75. That's at the Groom Lake facility. And then you have a more highly classified facility at S4. And S4 is by Fouche Lake. That's another area. It's only about 20 miles away or 30 kilometres away from the Groom Lake facility. They're both part of the Area 51 complex, but very different facilities. And according to Fouche, the Flying Triangle, the TR-3B, operates out of the S4 facility at Area 51. So that gives us a little bit of an idea of how they do things at Area 51 in terms of different projects and levels of classification and compartmentalisation. So people working on the Aurora project know absolutely nothing about the TR-3B project. And those that do know it, they feel, and Edgar Fouche is amongst those, they feel very privileged because in their view, they are part of the most advanced aerospace project on the planet. That's what they truly believe. And it's very important to understand that due to compartmentalisation, they are led or they are encouraged in that belief system. And so this is the way in which it operates, the classification system. People truly are indoctrinated into believing that the project that they have been cleared to really is the most advanced or the most breakthrough technology project around. Now the TR-3B, according to Fouche, became operational in the early 90s, but nevertheless there was testing happening, and he says that cases, famous UFO cases like the Flying Triangle sightings in Belgium in 1989, these were TR-3Bs. These were the craft that were used or based out of Area 51, out of S4. And so these craft would fly from the S4 facility and could make the transatlantic flight very, very quickly. They could be over there, over England, or over northern England, over Europe, over the Atlantic Ocean, in like half an hour or something like that. Incredible speeds that they could achieve, and so they could be seen all over the world. So according to Fouche, this is what was going on with the TR-3B, and the sightings are of it while it was being tested or put into operation. So this gives us an answer then to the question, well, if Reagan was correct, and no reason why we would doubt an American president who was putting in his diaries what happened, that, and I think Reagan actually was probably one of the more honest of the American presidents. He really said, he said what was on his mind often, and his handlers were often frantic, especially when it came to the UFO issue. I mean, he was known for talking off the cuff about UFOs and how important this was and how the world needed to get together. And his handlers would kind of like try and cut that out of the speech, and he'd put it back in. So Reagan definitely knew things, and he tried to talk about it as much as possible. So that's one of the jewels from Ronald Reagan, that 1985 reference, where he really, I believe, was giving us some sort of official acknowledgement of a space station, a spy station that was built up there and that was secretly being serviced. And so now, with the information we have from Edgar Fouche, we know that the SR-74, the TR-3B, these are at least two vehicles that are servicing these NRO, USAF or Space Command space stations up in Earth orbit that use cloaking or stealth technologies so that they're not observed up there. But that is, at least we know of two vehicles, and I'm sure there are probably some more, but these are the two that we can be pretty certain do those kinds of trips. So the NRO, US Air Force run that. Now, this is where we get into the whole idea of cover programs, using one level of classified program as a cover for another level. So as far as NASA is concerned, I think many people have said that NASA is kind of like a public relations exercise. It's really to make the public feel that, you know, things happening in space, you know, somehow that's related to NASA, or that NASA would tell us the truth. You know, and the acronym tells us obviously, you know, NASA stands for Never a Straight Answer. I mean, that's clearly what it means, right? Despite what others tell you, that's the real meaning of NASA. And they really don't tell you. Who knows that just, I think it was just today or yesterday, NASA announced that it was cancelling the live feed from the International Space Station. Yeah, they don't want you to know what's going on up there. They want to spin things. I mean, the space station, the live cameras was capturing too many things up there that was getting the newspapers kind of excited, and UFO researchers were definitely on the ball in spotting a lot of these things. But NASA has been a useful cover for this secret space program run by the US Air Force and the NRO. So anything you see going up into space could always be attributed to NASA. And I thought that there was a very helpful slide from the Edward Snowden revelations, where he released a lot of documents from the National Security Agency showing how the classification system operates and how programs can be used as covers for even more highly classified programs. And so there you have at the very top, the umbrella is Sentry Eagle. So that's a program like the Aurora project, right? So if you're a congressman, a US congressman, and you get to, you know, your constituents tell you they're running UFOs out of Area 51, you should find out that, you know, what's going on down there, and you make a big fuss and all of that, then the Air Force or the CIA will kind of give you a guided tour of the Groom Lake facility at Area 51 and show you the big secret. The big secret at Area 51 is the Aurora project, and that is really highly classified. That's what people are seeing up there. So you show them the SR-74, the SR-75, and the congressman is kind of like briefed that you know, this is very highly classified. He can't breathe a word of this even to his wife. And that's the way it is. And so the congressman comes back very impressed. And so the next time his constituent tells him that UFOs are being run out of Area 51, he'll kind of say, well, you know, he'll give him some sort of story about what's happening down there that's not really the truth, but because the congressman has been briefed to a limited extent, he feels that he's got his answer or her answer. But in fact, the Aurora project, as we have already kind of seen, is a cover for even more classified programs like TR-3B operating out of the S4 facility at Fouche Lake at Area 51. So that congressman, there's no way he would be taken to the S4 facility. That's like no such facility exists. The congressman who goes to Area 51 is given a guided tour by Air Force or CIA handlers, he's told absolutely no truth to rumours that there is something happening at S4. All the action here is at Fouche Lake, at Groom Lake with the SR-74, and that all of this other information about flying saucers and anti-gravity craft, that's just CIA disinformation. So then, so that's the cover, the means in which classified programs like the Aurora project are used as covers for even more highly classified programs like the TR-3B that are used to service these secret space stations that are cloaked in Earth orbit, that's all run by the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office. So when we're talking about the secret space program, if you ask Edgar Fouche and people operating out of Area 51, well, they'll pat you on the back if you know about the TR-3B, because that's it. That's the secret space program. Good for you. You worked it out. That's it. Nothing more. Everything else is disinformation. So that is one way in which the secret about multiple secret space programs is kept. That those involved in these other programs, these cover programs, are convinced that there's nothing higher, there's nothing more advanced. But this program, the NRO US Air Force program, is a cover for another program which is run by the US Navy. And this is the logo for the Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command, also known as SPAWAR, that has offices in San Diego, California, and that is involved in a lot of highly advanced engineering or planning involving a secret space program. But the real secret space program, the most highly classified program, is run not by the Air Force but by the US Navy. So that's where we're going to go now. We're going to kind of find out, well, what does the Navy know? How much of this, what the US Navy has developed over the years, how much of that is due to these Nazi scientists developing, say, anti-gravity technologies or torsion field physics, high voltage electrostatics? How much of the Navy space program is influenced or based on that? So to understand what the Navy has been doing, there's someone who has recently come forward who has talked about a covert Navy program that operated during World War II. How many of you know of William Tompkins? If you just raise your hands so I can get an idea. Okay, not quite half of you. Okay, so most of you don't know William Tompkins. So let me give you a little bit of the backstory for William Tompkins. He came forward in December of 2015 with a book and with some radio interviews, and I thankfully was able to track him down as well to find out what it was that he knows about the Navy's involvement in developing a secret space program. And he says that during the Second World War, he was involved in a Navy program that involved 29 operatives that were in occupied Europe during the Second World War. And these Navy spies were bringing information back to the Navy, to an area in California, which was the Naval Air Station out of San Diego. Now, why Tompkins? Why was Tompkins part of this program? He was only about 17 at the time when Tompkins was identified as someone with a precocious ability to reproduce complex ship designs. So what happened was that during the 1930s, the US Navy did something that it had never done before. It had brought the Eastern Fleet over to the Pacific Ocean, and they actually had all the ships in the naval shipyards at Long Island, there kind of just south of Los Angeles. And the ships had a lot of classified armaments on them, a lot of classified radar domes. This was classified information. But nevertheless, they gave public tours, but people weren't allowed to bring cameras. So Tompkins, as a young man, he began as a teenager in the early 1930s, and by 1941, he was around 17, 18, and he had gone with his father to do tours of these docked ships in the deep water out there in near Los Angeles, and he went on the ships and he looked at all of the gun placements, all of the radar facilities or technologies they had there, and a lot of other things that for the Navy was top secret, that you couldn't photograph. But Tompkins had a photographic memory. So what Tompkins did, he did designs. He wrote down the designs of these when he got home, and he was able to measure the specific distances between different parts of the craft. So over a period of several years, he was able to develop very accurate designs that he then used for developing models. So here you have some of the models that Bill Tompkins developed that he eventually had displayed in a Los Angeles department store. And what happened was that people admired the accuracy of these craft. And so when you had Navy personnel coming by, they were very impressed with Tompkins. And when you had Navy intelligence people coming by, they looked at it and they said, "My God, we've got a spy amongst us." And so they brought Tompkins' father in for interrogation because they were convinced Tompkins' father was a spy because he was the one that had arranged for the planes or for the ships to be put in this department store. So after they interrogated Tompkins' father for a couple of days, they were convinced that he was telling the truth, that his son had actually just designed these things from visiting or going out and looking at the boats that were displayed out in the Deepwater Harbour out there. And so then they brought the son in, Bill Tompkins, and they interrogated him and looked at his room and saw the kind of piles of designs and his complex drawings and his efforts in creating new models. And they realised that what they had on their hands was not a spy, but an incredibly talented young man with a photographic memory who had a capacity to understand complex ship designs and draw them to very high degrees of accuracy. And so the Navy decided, well, we want you. We want you to work for us. And so the Navy recruited Tompkins, and it wasn't just the US Navy, it was US Navy intelligence recruited Tompkins into doing work for the Navy. And so, this is part of the documentation Tompkins has supplied, just showing him with his model ships. And this was a news story by the Evening Outlook from March of 1941, where he's showing his ships to a Navy captain. Now, Tompkins has supplied a lot of documentation supporting his testimony. So here you have a document basically showing that Tompkins' mission order was to be a disseminator of naval aircraft research and information. Now Tompkins was only a teenager when he first began to do this. His job was to be a disseminator of naval aircraft research and information. What exactly did that mean? Well, Tompkins was part of this program that I briefly mentioned of 29 Navy spies that would be rotated in and out of occupied Europe, who would report to the Naval Air Station in San Diego and report on what it was that they had seen. And Tompkins' job was to listen to the debriefings of these spies. And because of Tompkins' photographic memory, his ability to draw complex ship designs, his job was to accurately draw and design as best he could what it was that these Navy spies were describing. And so they were describing craft that the Nazis were developing in their aerospace programs. And then Tompkins' job, after he heard the Navy spies discuss what they had seen, then Tompkins would put together a briefing packet comprised of his drawings, comprised of any information he could put together on what the Navy spies had said, and then he would take that information in the form of a briefing packet to any aerospace company, any think tank, any university department where there were people that were able to understand what it was that the Nazis were doing. And according to Tompkins, and what the spies were reporting back was just so advanced that when he took the information to a lot of these aerospace companies or think tanks, the scientists or the engineers said, not possible. You know, this is a waste of my time. Get away. Don't come back. That sort of thing. He would get reactions like that because these were using principles that were non-Newtonian in many cases, as I mentioned, like the torsion field physics. This was something that during the Second World War simply wasn't understood by many scientists and many engineers. So they didn't have time for this. But nevertheless, Tompkins was under instructions to disseminate this to see if anyone could understand it, because the Navy needed to know, well, does anyone understand what the Germans are doing? And we need to know what they're getting up to, because this obviously has implications for the war effort. So, you know, they were trying to get intelligence on the Nazi projects and exactly what the capabilities were. So here's one of the documents that Tompkins has supplied that shows that he was authorized to carry out of the Naval Air Station in San Diego. So here you have US Naval Air Station San Diego. It gives you the name Tompkins. It tells you how many packages he can take out. And it says, and this is signed by an Admiral Bolter. So here he took out one package. This other document shows he took out 3 packages. So the Naval Air Station was a very heavily classified and very secure installation. So this document really is hard evidence that Tompkins was performing a very highly classified duty of transporting information related to naval aircraft design and development to outside actors or to institutions such as California Institute of Technology, or to Lockheed, or to Northrop and the big aerospace companies of the day, as well as the East Coast companies and military institutions at the time. Tompkins has revealed the name of the admiral who ran this project, and his official title was Assembly and Repair Officer at Naval Air Station San Diego from 1942 to 1946. So that was his official job. So his job was to make sure that the Navy planes, the aircraft that were used on the aircraft carriers and so forth, had the most advanced technologies, combat capabilities possible at the time. So his job was to repair them or retrofit them or do whatever was necessary to ensure that they had the most success in air operations during the Second World War. In the evenings, though, he had another job. So he was a very busy guy, Admiral Bolter. In the evenings, he ran this program with 29 Navy spies in Nazi Germany. And so these spies would basically, on a kind of 6-month rotation, would come in, stay for a week, give 5 or 6 debriefings, where Tompkins would, after each debriefing, kind of put together a briefing package that he would take during the day to whoever might be able to kind of shed information on that or clarity on that. And then in the evening, come back for the next debriefing. And so this went on throughout the Second World War, and there were approximately 1,200 of these debriefings of these 29 spies throughout the war. Now, one of the interesting things about Admiral Bolter was that he is one of the very few Navy officers that was given retroactive promotions, that during the Second World War he was performing the duties of an admiral and he wore an admiral's uniform, even though his official position was a captain in the Navy. So later on, in 1946, he was given a retroactive promotion by the Navy. So they do that. The Navy does many things. They're very creative there. So they gave him a retroactive promotion to Rear Admiral, dating from 1943, April 6, 1943, which is a little bit after Tompkins says that Bolter began this program. So that, again, is hard evidence that Admiral Bolter did exist. This is the man who was signing the the exit slips for William Tompkins to take these debriefing packets out of the Naval Air Station to whatever aerospace company might be able to understand what the Nazis were doing in their aerospace programs. So this is the man. So Bolter is the man that was responsible for that. But I wanted to draw your attention to this name underneath Bolter. So Rico Bolter here. Whoops. Underneath him is another retroactive promotion, Leslie C. Stevens. He was retroactively promoted from July 3rd of 1943. And Stevens worked in a similar field to Bolter in terms of aircraft design and development. So they were doing similar things. Now, how many people have heard of Leslie Stevens? Okay, one of you. The Outer Limits. Anyone know of the Outer Limits? You know now who Leslie Stevens was? So Leslie Stevens, the creator of the Outer Limits, was the son of Admiral Leslie Stevens. Now, who sat in on the Leslie Stevens Outer Limits television shows, you know, the production facility? Who sat in on that and then created a very famous television show? Who sat in on that? Rod Sterling. Okay, there's another one. The Star Trek guy, we all know. Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry sat in on those Outer Limits episodes. So the idea of a US Navy-run space program, Gene Roddenberry got those from Leslie Stevens. And there have been people who have followed up on Leslie Stevens Jr. and said that he was very knowledgeable about a Navy programs or classified Navy programs. And that many of his ideas of a space program, using the USS Enterprise, all these advanced concepts that became part of the Star Trek series, a lot of that came from this Leslie Stevens. So I thought that that was a very interesting connection. So what we know then, according to Tompkins, is that the Navy has been involved in the development of a secret space program, and that the Navy has quietly encouraged soft disclosure. And soft disclosure is things like getting some of the information out through a fictional television series like Star Trek or The Outer Limits. And Leslie Stevens was involved in that. So Admiral Leslie Stevens was able to tell his son some of what was going on in these top secret Navy programs in order to have soft disclosure. And so this kind of gives us an idea then of what was happening with Star Trek. Star Trek was not just, you know, the imagination of Gene Roddenberry run wild. Gene Roddenberry was getting his information from Leslie Stevens Jr. that was telling Roddenberry, you know, these are the sort of things that the Navy's up to or is planning to do. Planning, that's the important thing here. They were planning to do that, or in process. So Tompkins is a very important figure in understanding the secret space programs and how they involved. Now, the other gentleman who I alluded to earlier is Corey Goode. And Corey is someone who has revealed multiple secret space programs, and a majority of you know of Corey's testimony. Just very briefly, he is someone that has said that from the years 1987 to 2007, he was recruited into a secret space program run by the US Navy called Salla Warden. And that during that time, he performed his missions, that he was trained to be an intuitive empath, which meant that his job was to discern whether or not someone was being truthful. And so he worked in that capacity. And during his tour of duty, that 20-year tour of duty, he says that he was given access to these smart glass pads, that these were used in the secret space programs, and that they basically had intelligence briefings on them. And these smart glass pads had a lot of information about the history of the secret space programs and of the current operations of the secret space programs from 1987 to 2007. And since Corey Goode has come forward, he's disclosed an incredible amount of information about these secret space programs. And many of you have tuned in to the Cosmic Disclosure series, or maybe you've read the email interviews I did with him, or learned about him in some other ways. But he definitely has shared a lot of information. Now, very recently, the last couple of weeks, Cosmic Disclosure has started to air interviews involving Bill Tompkins and Corey Goode with David Wilcock. Anyone seen the interviews with Bill Tompkins? Okay, just a few of you. So one of the things that was I found very interesting was that Corey Goode realized that a lot of the information that he was reading on these smart glass pads from 1987 to 2007, that a lot of that information sounded very familiar, if not identical, to the information that William Tompkins said he was disseminating from 1941 to 1945. And when Bill Tompkins described the situation with a stenographer kind of typing the debriefings of these Navy spies and of the briefing packets that were created by Corey Goode, that were created by Bill Tompkins, Corey said that that was the same information that he was reading on the smart glass pads. So here you have a really interesting connection and corroboration of what Tompkins and Goode say they respectively did. That 40 years after Bill Tompkins had participated in these Navy debriefings and put together these briefing packets for dissemination elsewhere, that information was later on uploaded to these smart glass pads where Corey Goode from 1987 to 2007 read the same information, which kind of helps understand the incredible congruity between their testimonies when it comes to what we're going to be discussing very shortly in terms of what it was that the Nazis had achieved there and what the capabilities of the Nazis' secret space programs were. Through very independent tracks and sources, Corey Goode and William Tompkins were using the same information packs, or some of it anyway. Now, in September of 2015, my book was published, and that used a lot of the available whistleblower testimony and a lot of the documents that's publicly available to kind of analyse what Corey Goode was saying. And the conclusion in my book was that Corey is absolutely authentic and his information is very accurate and consistent with what has been released. And so you can read about that in the book, my analysis there. But what was very gratifying for me personally was when Tompkins emerged in December of 2015 with the publication of his book. Now, the interesting thing here is that Tompkins' book was edited by Dr. Robert Wood, who's a colleague, and Dr. Wood had gotten a copy of my book, published 3 months earlier, and read it, and said, he told Bill Tompkins, this is incredible, you've got to read this. This matches what you're saying. And so Bill Tompkins read the book as well, got a copy, and found that it was a match, that the two sets of information matched, that the information in his book that came out 3 months after my September book, that it was talking about very similar things, that the sources were very accurate. So that was very gratifying because Dr. Wood himself is a very highly credentialed aerospace engineer. He worked for Douglas Aircraft Company, the same company that William Tompkins worked for from 1951 to 1963. And I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that later. So that way, Dr. Wood was able to confirm that Tompkins was the real deal, that he had worked at Douglas, and that and a lot of the information Tompkins had shared in his book was very accurate. So we'll get to that shortly. So now let's get to the question of, well, what was it that the Navy spies had learned was occurring in Nazi Germany? What did they see? Well, they talked about the Nazis developing up to 30 different prototypes of flying saucer craft. And some of these craft were weaponized. Okay? So there was an attempt by the Nazis not only to develop flying saucers, but to weaponize these. Now, this is not quite as easy as you might think. I mean, putting a cannon on an aircraft, okay, you know, that was an engineering challenge itself, and certainly eventually the Air Force was able to solve the puzzle of, you know, how do you shoot bullets from an aircraft through the spinning propeller without the bullets shredding the propeller. So they were able to work that out. But how do you put a cannon or machine guns or anything like that on a spinning flying saucer? I mean, you have an incredibly complex engineering problem there. So what was it that why did the Nazis not successfully achieve this incredible engineering feat? It might simply be because they didn't have time to solve it. I mean, it was the engineering problems of weaponizing flying saucers, which were incredibly new technologies that had been developed. This was something that could not be done overnight. It would take time. But nevertheless, the Nazis had developed these to a certain extent. Now, why was it that the Nazis were able to develop these advanced flying saucers? Where did they get that information? Well, there are two sources that I'll kind of briefly refer to here. I'll talk about this more tomorrow in the workshop for those that are planning to come. I'll go into great depth into the different ET groups that were involved in the Nazi German flying saucer program. But there were competing extraterrestrial groups that were working with the Nazis from the beginning. There was a group of human-looking Nordic extraterrestrials. Guess who that is? Very attractive-looking beings, and that they were helping the Nazis, or at least not so much the Nazis, because the thing to remember is that Germany, after the defeat of the First World War, their defeat in the First World War, up until 1933 was a republic, the Weimar Republic. And there were German secret societies and philanthropists that were working on these kinds of advanced aerospace programs, because they had been given information from one of these Nordic races or more through telepathic means. And so they developed the first prototypes of the flying saucers. Then in 1933, Hitler comes to power. The Nazi SS starts to kind of look at what advanced aerospace programs exist out there. They noticed what the German secret societies were doing, and so they kind of integrated that into their own programs. And then at a certain time, another group of extraterrestrials came into the picture and began to work with the Nazis, with the Nazi SS, kind of like attracts like type thing. The Nazi SS, they were intent on world conquest. We know all about their philosophy, the Nazi philosophy, Aryan supremacy and all of that. Well, that kind of philosophy drew a particular group of extraterrestrials into their orbit. They drew into their orbit this imperialistic extraterrestrial group known as the reptilians, and they began to work with the Nazi SS in developing these prototypes. Developing the prototypes that the Nazis had developed. Now, out of the 30 prototypes I just mentioned just before, those 30 prototypes, according to William Tompkins, I believe it was, he says 14 of these were given complete without any kind of, not designs, we're talking about complete flying saucer craft. 14 of those were given to the Nazis. By the reptilians, and the rest were developed either through communications with these Nordic extraterrestrials or through German scientists coming up with their own pioneering techniques. So, do we know that the Germans were helped? Well, according to Professor Hermann Oberth, who's known as the father of the rocket program, and also was involved in the NASA program, he said, quote, "We cannot take the credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped by the people of other worlds." So this is the man who inspired Wernher von Braun and other prominent Nazi scientists. So that's Hermann Oberth there, and von Braun, and this is at a NASA facility. And that was where you had acknowledgement by a very prominent German scientist that the Nazis were helped. And certainly that is what William Tompkins says happened. That is what Corey Goode says happened. And here you have Hermann Oberth acknowledging the same thing. And others have said similar things. So what else happened? Well, this is where we get into the whole Antarctica element of the Nazi program. Because what was happening in Nazi Germany wasn't just one space program. There were two space programs. One was run by the SS that, as we saw, were trying to weaponize this to use in the war. And apparently they achieved a certain amount of success. So they developed, they were able to kind of weaponize some of these flying saucer craft, and there were stories that they were able to get up there and actually saw combat, and that some of these operational flying saucers did see combat up there during the war. But nevertheless, the main space program was not occurring in Germany or occupied Europe, but was occurring somewhere else. And that the Nazis were actually guided or given information by this reptilian race to go to Antarctica, because there they would be given access to underground caverns or locations where they could create a base. So here you have in 1939 the first Nazi Antarctic expedition in January of 1939, where they basically began to map out Antarctica and establish a presence there. And so they were able to establish a presence in Antarctica and apparently found some caverns, some underground caverns that they were able to somehow access. There were submarines that were part of the mission, as well as aircraft and an aircraft carrier and so forth. And so there was film taken of this Nazi Antarctic expedition from 1939, and this is one of the shots of what they found under their huge caverns, according on the Rentz website, where Jeff Rentz has found the historical film that the Nazis had put out of their discoveries in Antarctica, and they had found these very large caverns in Antarctica. Now, one of the things that is important to mention here is that Antarctica is a vast continent, and there are depictions of it when it was ice-free. There have been a number of cartographers who have been able to use kind of radar, ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to be able to map out the Antarctic coastline under the ice, because the ice sheet is about 2 miles thick, and under the ice, this is what they found, that in fact Antarctica, you can see, has a number of very large underground waterways that are part of the ocean. Or here, it's an huge underground lake there. So this is what an ice-free Antarctica would look like. Now, according to conventional science, they say that Antarctica was ice-free hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. But we know from the Peri-Race maps and the Orontes-Phineas maps that cartographers from the 16th century were able to access old records that showed Antarctica ice-free. That the history of Antarctica is not what we have been told. That at some point Antarctica was ice-free, and that very likely there was some kind of advanced civilization down there. And certainly that is what the Nazis have been told by this race of reptilians, according to Tompkins and Good. And so the Nazis went down there and took a lot of equipment, a lot of resources down there to build an underground base. And so here you have the comparison between the ice-covered Antarctica and the ice-free Antarctica. And you can see, obviously, how very different they are. But in the ice-covered Antarctica, those waterways have not disappeared. How could you get there? If, for example, there was those waterways are still there, and just say there are huge caverns or openings where those waterways open up under the ice, how would you get there? Any guesses? In a USO, in a submarine. That's exactly right. That's how you would get there. And so we have these documents that have emerged from former captains, Nazi captains, of their U-boat fleets that detail the route that the submarine captains have to take to reach the hidden underground bases in Antarctica. And so that gives you the description of the different steps, different ways in which they would navigate. And there are a number of these documents that have been released. You can do a Google search on this directions for Nazi submarines to Antarctica, and you'll see a bunch of documents and some articles that detail this. But this is documentation that the Nazis had received guidance or gotten guidance in terms of where to go. Now, according to Tompkins, the Nazis were given 2 bases, or 2 very large underground bases in Antarctica by these reptilians who were in a larger adjacent cavern system. And that the Nazis were given the information on how to locate these huge underground caverns and the instructions on how to get there with submarines, by submarines. And the Nazis during the Second World War, their submarine production was phenomenal. They produced several thousand submarines during the course of the Second World War. Their submarine construction became so advanced that despite the bombings, the Allied bombings, they were still producing one submarine a day. That's how much the production facilities was churning out each day. So they churned out thousands of these submarines. Of course, we know a lot of these submarines were used for the war effort, but a lot of these submarines, some of them were built, they were very large transportation submarines. So they were taking large numbers of people, equipment, resources, munitions, whatever, to Antarctica. And so that meant that during the Second World War, while the hostilities were raging in Europe, in Antarctica, then throughout the war, and this is the important point, Tompkins and both Good stress, is that throughout the Second World War, the Nazis were transporting lots of equipment and people down to Antarctica for their other space program, which was not a weaponization program. It was more of a space exploration program, and that was being run by the German secret societies. That these German secret societies were still very influential. You know, many people assume that Adolf Hitler was a totalitarian leader and was at the apex of control. What we know now is that he wasn't at the apex of control. The people that were in control are the same people that are in control of all governments today. You know, they're behind the scenes, they are involved in secret societies, and they hoard incredible wealth and advanced technologies for themselves. And so they did the same during the Second World War, where they took their most advanced technologies and their brightest scientists to Antarctica to develop a space program that was not intent on winning the Second World War. Their goal was to develop, their long-term goal was to develop fleets of spacecraft that would eventually be able to cooperate with the reptilian extraterrestrials in their goal of galactic conquest. So that was the long-term goal. So that's kind of in a nutshell what was going on down in Antarctica. They had a long-term goal, and winning the war in Europe was not a priority at all. And one of the things I found very interesting in the Corey Goode information was that he actually said that the Germans in Antarctica withheld their most advanced technologies from the Nazis in Europe. That Hitler had been promised or led to believe that he would be given or helped in developing the advanced technologies that they would need to win the war, but in the end they were denied that. So that in a way, the German secret societies, they weren't too perturbed by the Nazis losing the war in Europe, because their long-term goal required cooperation with the United States. And so even though the war was lost in Europe, Plan B was to get the United States on board and getting the US military-industrial complex working. So we'll get to that in a moment. So now we get to the thing which for many people that are new to this is a big shock, because the first man on the moon was, who? Who was the first man on the moon? Neil Armstrong. Okay, an American, kind of, you know, true American hero, Neil Armstrong. Well, according to the information that Corey Goode and Bill Tompkins has shared, the first man on the moon was Herr Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt went to the moon. During the Second World War, this is, again, incredible information. During the Second World War, out of Antarctica, the Nazis were launching spacecraft to the moon. And they established a base on the moon. Again, this is incredible information, but this is what we are being told by these whistleblowers. The Nazis went to the moon, established a base on the moon. And they didn't just stop there, they went on. They went further than the moon. Again, this is a shock for a lot of people, and how could this possibly have happened? This has to be disinformation. This has to be nonsense. Surely Schmidt didn't get to Mars as well. Did Hersch Schmidt make it to Mars as well? Well, Mr. Schmidt did make it to Mars as well, according to Corey Goode and Tompkins, that these German secret societies, that they began to colonize Mars in the 1940s, out of Antarctica. Out of Antarctica. They were sending manned missions to Mars in the mid-40s. Now, of course, the war in Europe comes to an end. Everyone celebrates. The Nazis have been defeated. We can all go home. Then you have something really strange happening. You have this Operation High Jump, 1946, 1947. The USS Philippine Sea leads a battle group, a US Navy battle group with lots of planes and Marines, 4,000 personnel on a scientific exploration to Antarctica. What in the world is going on? Admiral Byrd was part of that, and Admiral Byrd has been very much involved in the affairs in Antarctica for quite some time. And I will talk more about that tomorrow if you're interested. But what we learned from official press releases and public records is that some of the Navy craft from Operation High Jump crashed, and that there were some casualties. So there you have some of the craft that had crashed with casualties being rescued. Now, according to interviews that Admiral Byrd had with a number of South American newspapers, Operation High Jump had encountered an enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds, and that there had been casualties, significant casualties, that had been suffered by Operation High Jump. So that is where we get a little bit of the truth that there was a new enemy. Who was this new enemy? Well, this new enemy in a way was the old enemy, the Nazis, or German secret societies. It was based in Antarctica, and it had developed craft that could outperform anything that the US Navy had. So the US Navy sent their best craft down to Antarctica, and they were basically blown out of the water. The descriptions that have been that have come forward about the battle in Antarctica was that there were waves of USOs or flying saucers that came out of the ocean and attacked the Navy flotilla and destroyed all of the aircraft and sunk some of the ships, but not all of the ships, that the whole flotilla was open to being destroyed by what the Nazis or what the German secret space program had down there. But they left the rest of the flotilla to come back. And that was to basically give the US Navy a bloody nose and to let the Navy know that, don't come back, and that there was a new enemy, this kind of Fourth Reich, if you like, a Fourth Reich that now had reconstituted itself in Antarctica, and it meant business, and that we'll come calling on you. Don't come to us, we'll come to you. So, it took a few years, but eventually they did go to visit President Truman, who sent Admiral Byrd down there to Antarctica. And so the Nazis sent their welcoming committee to the US to visit President Truman, and this is what they saw, according to Tompkins and Goode. Now, many of you, and I certainly believed when I first came across the information about the Washington, D.C. UFO sightings, that these were probably extraterrestrial craft. But according to Goode and Tompkins, these were not at all extraterrestrial craft. these were Nazi UFOs. And that Clark McClelland, another whistleblower, who actually worked with the Nazi scientists out of the Kennedy Space Center in the 1960s, he was told the same thing by the Nazi German scientists, that these were Nazi UFOs flying over Washington, D.C. So the Nazis did return, they did come back, and they were visiting the US, and they were doing a flyover of the Capitol. And out of Andrews Air Force Base, the US Air Force sent their most advanced craft at the time, jet aircraft at the time, and they basically were able to, they tried to intercept or tried to bring down some of these craft, some of these flying saucers, but they had absolutely no success. They had no way of being able to intercept these craft, and they were seen by many, many others. Thousands of people witnessed these flying saucers over Washington, D.C. at the time. And according to Good and Tompkins, deals were made. Deals were made, and these deals led to this. So maybe this is a good point to pause, and I can come back. It's 3 o'clock. I think we needed to have a break, and we can come back. I think it's in 30 minutes.
3:30. It's 3 o'clock now.
It's 3 o'clock now. And we come back at 3:30. Thank you. From the first part, when I said the first German on the moon was Herr Schmidt, I didn't actually literally mean that the name of the man was Herr Schmidt, because in German that translates as Mr. Smith. And so Mr. Smith goes to Washington, Mr. Smith goes to the moon, and but I don't know the name of the actual German that did go to the moon. So yeah, just to clarify that. So what we know now is that these Nazi UFOs flew over Washington, D.C. in 1952 to send a message to the US military establishment that the Nazi technologies, the German secret space programs, had achieved a level of technical superiority over anything that the US had, that they could actually visit the capital of the United States and fly overhead without being in any way harmed by the best defense system that the US Air Force had, because the Air Force basically deploys its top fighter squadrons out of Andrews Air Force Base, which is there to basically protect that whole Washington, D.C. area and the Pentagon. And so they did send their fighter jets up there to intercept, and they couldn't do a thing. So by demonstrating their military superiority, basically they were telling the US that they needed to negotiate a deal. And according to Tompkins and according to Good and a number of other whistleblowers like Clark McClelland, deals were reached between the Fourth Reich. That's probably a way of describing this breakaway Nazi group, or this resurgent Nazi presence in Antarctica, with what they were planning to do, or what they were doing at the time. And so deals were reached, and so the US military-industrial complex basically, I think, made a deal with the devil, if you like. They were able to supply resources and personnel, and in exchange, they got some information that they thought would help them build their own space program. So, and from the perspective of the US military establishment in 1952, if you were sitting in their seat and you were trying to make a decision as to what to do, given that these Nazis had flown over the capital and you weren't able to do a thing about it, what are you going to do? Well, maybe you'll play for time and say, let's reach a deal. Let's try and get as much as we can from those, SOBs, and then see if at some time we can kind of assert ourselves and or catch up or get ahead. So that was probably the thinking at the time, but nevertheless, deals were made according to these whistleblowers. And so this then takes us to what was happening in the aerospace companies at the time of these deals being made, and what was being planned, and what was the role of the Navy, the US Navy, in the midst of these kinds of deals. So what we have now is a document that shows or substantiates Bill Tompkins' claims that he worked at Douglas Aviation Company, and that he was at a section of Douglas Engineering called Advanced Design, a think tank, where UFOs and anti-gravity technologies were being studied. And Tompkins said that essentially the think tank at Douglas was given these assignments by the US Navy to come up with designs for spacecraft. Now, everyone, of course, quite rightly says, well, where's the documentation to support any of this? Well, here you have a document from the Douglas Aircraft Company showing that in 1955, the two individuals that Tompkins says were his superiors, Elmer Wheaton and a Dr. Klemperer, that those two individuals were actively studying unconventional propulsion systems that included anti-gravity, and that they were studying flying saucers. So this document substantiates Tompkins' claims that while at Douglas, there was a secret effort to develop anti-gravity craft and to better understand the principles for anti-gravity propulsion systems. So Tompkins says that around that time frame, 1955, that's when he came up with the first designs for a space battle group. And that, so this was one of the designs that's in his book, page 68, selected by Extraterrestrials, that shows a naval spacecraft battle cruiser, several kilometres in length, 2 kilometres, which is quite a difference with what I earlier discussed with the TR-3B. I don't know if I actually mentioned that dimensions of the TR-3B that's flown out of Area 51, the S4 facility, that has a wingspan of 600 feet, which is about what people report, who have sighted it in Belgium and northern England, 600 feet. Well, here we're talking about craft that are 2 kilometres in length or more. So we are clearly talking about a scale vastly different in terms of the engineering of this kind of craft. And here's another one, a naval spacecraft carrier and also a transport vehicle, again, several kilometres in length, that Tompkins was asked to design for the Navy. And so this is what was happening at the Douglas Aircraft Company in the 1950s, that their engineers were putting together these designs for the Navy's plan for its own space battle groups, that the Navy has a very different kind of strategic planning when they think in the future in terms of craft or what their assets are going to be. As far as the Air Force is concerned, they develop squadrons of aircraft, as many as they can, which are then going to be deployed from whatever operational base they have. So if we're talking about fleets of TR-3Bs, they can be launched from the Earth, obviously. They can go out to space. If there's a space station, a secret space station up there, maybe they could have some of these TR-3Bs use that as a base for forward operations. But definitely you're pretty fixed, especially as far as I've been able to determine that it appears that the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office have responsibility for Earth orbital platforms and operations. Anything happening near the Earth goes under US Air Force Space Command. Anything happening in deep space, that's what the US Navy deals with. And as far as where the Navy is building these things, Tompkins says that it's basically out of an area in Utah near the Wasatch Mountains, which is a very remote area. And that's, maybe you could want to call it Area 52, even though that's not it. That's not the real name. Dugway Proving Grounds, a vast area of Utah, which is not populated, and they have massive underground facilities, multi-level facilities where they can actually build these space carriers, these kilometre-long space carriers. So that's what's happening out at Wasatch. So when people say that you know, they're going to reveal the secrets of Area 51, well, really what they're talking about is the secrets of kind of like a secondary space program, not the real one that's actually operating in deep space and able to access other solar systems. Now, one of the things is that there was a lot of struggle between different groups that were interested in what the US military-industrial complex was doing. Of course, those in Antarctica that were allied with these reptilian groups, they wanted to get from the US, they wanted to siphon out or suck out of the US military-industrial complex as much as they could and give back as little as possible. I mean, that's obviously would have been, you know, their strategy. And one of the other things that they did was that they were able to get their kind of agent saboteurs, their fifth columnists, into the US space program, into the Apollo program, the NASA program, and even this effort at the different aerospace companies to develop space battle groups for the US Navy. And so, for example, the industrial sabotage or the Nazi infiltration got so bad that the head of the advanced design section at Douglas, where Tompkins worked, he resigned. He got so fed up with engineers being reassigned or going disappearing, work that had been conducted on some of these very secretive projects suddenly disappearing, that he got so fed up that he eventually went over to Lockheed because he felt that the Douglas Aviation Company had been infiltrated, or there were people at Douglas that that didn't want Douglas to be a part of any successful US Navy space program, and so there was sabotage. So he left, and then Tompkins, less than a year later, was sacked by Douglas. And so we need to keep in mind that Tompkins was really a key person in the Douglas advanced design in developing these fleets of anti-gravity spacecraft, or these battle groups, because his expertise was so much at that, you know, had reached such a level at that point, you know, because of his wartime service, his familiarity with the different designs, what the Nazis had developed in Antarctica, because he was familiar with all of that, you know, and for him to be sacked just is kind of more evidence that, you know, that Douglas really had been infiltrated, or that there are people there that didn't want it to kind of produce or contribute meaningfully to the creation of a US Navy space program. But nevertheless, the Navy went ahead with its very classified program out of the Wasatch Mountains and finally began operations in 1984. That is the year that, being told by Tompkins and Corey Goode, this is when the Solar Warden program first began working. So 8 space battle groups were developed beginning in the 1980s. And then by the end of the 80s, you had 8 of these. And according to Bill Tompkins, the philosophy was similar to the way in which the Navy runs aircraft carrier battle groups, that typically you have half on duty and the other half undergoing repairs, upgrades, whatever training was necessary. So you can only have half of these kind of operational at any one time. So 8 of these were developed, and 4 were deployed in deep space, doing whatever missions, and the other 4 were undergoing repairs in Utah. And one of the things that I'll discuss more tomorrow is the way in which the different ET groups, the reptilians and the Nordics, either helped or tried to sabotage this US Navy space program. So that'll be something I'll go into more detail in tomorrow. So now, okay, so you've got 8 space battle groups, 4 operational at any one time with space carriers, space cruisers, escort ships. You know, that's a battle group out in deep space. How are you going to man these? I mean, how are you going to get personnel? Are you going to tell them, like the Navy, you know, typically recruits, I think, 4-year terms or 6-year tours of duty? I mean, imagine if you're trying to keep this secret, that you have a space battle group, how are you going to recruit personnel and to keep morale? I mean, you can't just take people up there and say, well, you're going to be up here for the rest of your life. You know, like it or lump it, you're in the Navy now, you're in the Space Navy. I don't think that would have been a very wise strategy for the Navy. And so what happened was that technology was developed to get over this problem of how to deal with space recruits, how to deal with people that would be in space for extended periods of time. And you know, that's the other thing too. Time in space is very different, because when you're working with high energy plasma physics and torsion fields and so forth, and you know, space-time changes. So you can spend a lot of time in space, and you could come back, and maybe there's, you know, the years in space don't quite match up with the years on Earth, so you can have some kind of time dilation occurring. So how do you deal with these sorts of problems? Well, the strategy was to come up with age regression, and I think a lot of you here might be very interested in this next piece of technology that they developed. Age regression. Age regression was technology that was developed for the secret space programs. That was how they got over their problem with how to recruit people, because they basically promised them that, well, you come and serve with us 20 years. You give us 20 years of your life. Then what we're going to do is we are going to age regress you, so you get restored to the age when you began, and then you will be taken back in time and brought back to your family, and so you hardly lose any time at all. You're still with your family, but you have the benefit of having served 20 years, gotten a lot of experience. You know, you are now a veteran, and so we're going to give you benefits, and we're going to ensure that you get scholarships and all of those sorts of things. So very attractive package that they were giving these people, and so that's the basis in which these 20 and back programs would work to recruit personnel for these secret space programs. So, age regression, is it possible? Is it scientifically feasible? Well, the white world literature tells us that age regression is now a physical possibility. It's feasible now. I believe the name of the scientist, I think it was University of New South Wales, correct me if I'm wrong, but a Dr. David Sinclair. He did some pioneering work with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where they had some breakthroughs in coming up with age regression medical techniques or pharmaceutical products that would be able to physically regress organs. So they tested it on mice and found that they could regress muscles and organs and so forth, and they're now kind of getting ready for testing on humans. So this is the kind of white world, as it's known in people working in classified programs, that which is released into the public arena. But the black world, where you have the classified programs existing, you know, the rule of thumb is that anything that is being released in terms of the white world has been developed secretly in the black world for at least 30 years, if not longer. So that means that they have been working with age regression for at least 30 years, if not longer. And as Will Tompkins tells us, that's exactly what happened. Actually, he began working in 1967 from 1971, well over 40 years now, at TRW, which today is a part of Northrop Grumman, one of the major aerospace companies in the United States, that he began working on age regression technologies. that Tompkins was tasked to come up with a kind of systems engineering program whereby a bunch of medical doctors could create the pharmaceutical products for age regression. And that was his job. And so this is what he says he worked on then. And again, this kind of relates back to the Nazi era. It relates back to the kind of assistance that the extraterrestrials were giving to the Nazis, that age regression goes back even further to that time. But it was only in 1967 that, according to Tompkins, that the US military-industrial complex started to take it seriously, because they were thinking ahead. If we can master this technology, then eventually we'll have a means of being able to recruit people for the future space navy. So how do we know this happened? Well, according to Tompkins, he said this is what he oversaw, and Tompkins has confirmed that the 20 and back programs were very real. And so the three cases that I'm now going to cite, these are people who underwent a process that Tompkins said was very real. So here you have Michael Ralph, who's the first person to have come forward to say he went through one of these 20 and back programs, that for him it happened from 1976 to 1996, that he first, at the age of 5, he was subjected to abductions with grey extraterrestrials where he was actually genetically altered. He joined the Navy in 1976. So 1976, he's in the Navy. It's a 6-year term in the Navy. But then he's approached by a covert group within the Navy and says, you got the right stuff. And probably very aware of his genetics, grey altered or extraterrestrial altered genetic, and said, you got the right stuff for us. So we want you to join our program, and it's 20 years, and you'll get this and that when you finish, and be restored in age and so forth. So they gave him the whole spiel. So he said yes. So he says he was taken, after he signed his papers, he was taken to Mars via a jump gate, a kind of teleportation technology. And then he began his tour of duty on Mars as a kind of psychic operative, and eventually psychic assassination was the task he did, and also as a space fighter pilot. Then he finished his tour of duty in 1976. He underwent the age regression process and sent back in time, back to 1976 when he began his service. And so now he serves 6 years in the Navy with his memories removed of what happened. And then 82, he's honourably discharged. And then 1996, he begins having clearing sessions. So he starts getting his memories back of what happened to him. The second case is Randy Kramer. He also describes having experiences at a very young age. Basically, what I'm told is that people who are prepared for these secret space programs, that they're identified very early on as children, because that's when they're not front-loaded with a lot of beliefs and values that their parents or society would give them. So they get them before they're put through the education process, so that way they can train them to be skilled in an area that would be of value to the secret space program. So in the case of Randy Kramer, he says he was identified as someone who would be ideal for a super soldier program. So he was trained to be a super soldier. Mind control and so forth was used on him, and he was trained. These whistleblowers say that typically what happens is that the parents don't know the children are being trained, that because the technologies are so advanced that the children can be taken away for a month and then brought back through technology to the time when they kind of like just about left. So this is one of the remarkable things about time travel and the technologies that they use. So according to Randy Kramer, he was when he turned 17, In 1987, he's recruited into a unit called the Mars Defense Force. He says, in 1987, he is then taken to the moon for an old Nazi base, which has now been has been converted into a base that is being run by the one of the US secret space programs, and it's called Lunar Operations Command. And so then he begins service on Mars for 17 years. In 2004, he's then transferred to a spacecraft carrier and works as a fighter pilot for the remaining 3 years of his tour of duty, then completes that 20 years. Then he's put through the age regression process, and he describes more of the process itself. He says typically that you're put into some kind of chamber where you're kept physically immobilized for 2 years, where you're pumped full of drugs, and then you are physically age regressed. This is after you've been debriefed. So you're given a thorough debrief where you basically describe everything that happened during that 20 years. You're debriefed, put through the age regression process, then you're sent back in time 20 years earlier when you first began. Another debriefing occurs there, and then you are sent back to your family with your memories wiped. You lose the memories, and then you just live that 20 years again. So in the case of Randy Kramer, he says that in 2006, he started to remember his childhood training, but he didn't remember his space program service. After something to do, I guess, with the timeline for Randy Kramer, 2007, he starts getting total recall of his memories of what happened to him. And then in 2014, he did the first interviews as Captain K, and then a few months after going public, he then revealed his real identity as Randy Kramer. Corey Goode has a kind of similar history to Randy. He says that he also went through this 20-year and back program. Funnily enough, he says that he was, in the case of Corey, in 1986, he was then taken away from his family and prepared for service in the secret space program. But he says because he was physically still very short, at 16, that they did something to physically enhance him. And so then, after a few months, he's then taken to Lunar Operations Command at age 17, which is the same age that Randy Kramer says he was taken to Lunar Operations Command at age 17. So it's possible that Randy Kramer and Corey Goode were at the Lunar Operations Command at the same time. But Corey had a service in another part of the secret space program, working with Salla Warden from 1987 to 1993 on a scientific vehicle, and then as an intuitive empath. And then after completing his 20-year tour of duty, he again went through the same process of debriefing, age regression, being sent back in time, again being debriefed, and then being released to his family and to live the 20 years again as a private individual. Both Corey and Randy Kramer say that for both of them, they were instructed not to join the military because it was thought that somehow that would trigger their memories. In the case of Michael Ralph, he had already joined the Navy, so he was already in the Navy, so he stayed in that. Corey Goode is, how he differs from these other two cases is that he says that he never lost his memories, that the mind-wiping technology that was used, you know, you've seen Men in Black. You remember the Men in Black movie? Great movie. You remember that technology where you look here, flash, and you kind of you forget everything. Okay, so that's the kind of mind wipe. That technology is real. That mind can be wiped of certain categories of memories, and however they have designed that technology, apparently it's real and it works. So this was used on all of these 20 and back personnel, but in the case of Corey Goode, it didn't work. So this then takes us to the question of, is there any Australian involvement in the secret space program? So this is where I think it would be good to actually have you hear what Corey Goode has to say on this issue. So let me play that for you. Let's see. Whoops. Oh, that's not going to work. Just trying to get out of here. Oops. Oh, here we go.
Just when you mentioned the secret space programs there, just another question actually came in just in relation to that, so I'm going to throw that into the mix as well, and that's from Kim. Kim was wondering, does Australia, she's actually in Australia, does Australia have a secret space program? If so, do you know how does it fit in with the various the USA secret space programs?
Well, yeah, they're very much a part. Australia has different parts of their, infrastructure that are engaged in different special access programs. So they are involved from the bottom part of the special access, lower secret space programs, all the way up to the top. And it's like a layered cake and in varying degrees.
Okay. Does anyone need to listen to that again? You want me to play it again? Okay. All right. So now you hear from Corey exactly just how extensively involved the Australia is with the secret space programs. Okay. So let me see if I can do this. Now he mentioned the layered cake, and what that tells us is that what I mentioned earlier in terms of the NRO US Air Force Space Command program run out at Area 51 with stealth space stations in low Earth orbit, that is a program that involves Australian personnel as well, right across the spectrum, he said. Kind of makes a lot of sense. And of course, in the space programs that I've described in terms of the US Navy, both Corey and Randy Kramer say that, yes, there were Australians serving in that. So there may be Australians who have served for 20 years that might be in this audience. Anyone served for 20 years on a secret space program? Raise your hand. Okay, all right. Well, maybe we'll do that a little later, see what happens. So there are Australians that have gone through this, and they're out there somewhere, and they are sworn to secrecy, or maybe they haven't regained their memories, or whatever is going on, but certainly American secret space program personnel have come forward. So if Australians have gone through this, then I think the time is right for them to come forward as well. It's safe to do it. It's safe to do so. So who else has talked about Australia being involved in a secret space program? Well, Stan Deyo. He was trained as an aerospace engineer and research physicist. In his training, he says that he spent 3 years at the US Air Force Academy learning to be a pilot, obviously aiming to join the Air Force at some point as a fighter pilot. But that what happened in his case was that he was covertly trained in electrogravitics, that it was like almost like they were running two programs. Remember earlier on I mentioned the NASA program for training astronauts, and you had the NRO people with a secret cadre of military astronauts in the program, unknown to NASA. Well, similarly in the US Air Force, it appears that they had something similar going on, where they had people who had been identified for some reason as having certain skills, who would be given training in an area of interest for the study of anti-gravity or the space program. So Deo says he was covertly trained, and that he was involved after he left the Air Force on the development of anti-gravity technologies in various corporate laboratories, as well as developing his own private laboratories. He says that he was recruited by the FBI to be an agent, and that his job was to basically go in there to various corporations and work for them and tell the FBI, you know, what they're doing. And so this is kind of like, as I was saying before, a lot of industrial sabotage, a lot of groups trying to slow down or spy on who's doing what, even within the US military-industrial complex. Seems that the FBI was doing this with the assistance of Deo, who was specially trained to be knowledgeable about anti-gravity. And of course, with his Air Force training, he had an understanding of a lot of kind of aerodynamics principles and so forth. So he had been trained to essentially kind of be familiar with anti-gravity and to conduct espionage. But he got outed. And so he got outed, and before mentioning that, it's just worth emphasising that Edward Teller was the person that they are identified as being in charge of the US Anti-Gravity Research Project. And it kind of makes sense if, you know, when we talked about the TR-3B and developing torsion field physics to reduce weight. If you have technology to reduce weight, mass, what you need then is propulsion systems to be able to be used for your being able to travel in space. And so nuclear propulsion was one of those, and Teller was undoubtedly one of the leading nuclear scientists in the United States and in the world. So after Deo gets outed, he is advised to go to Australia. Now, why is that? So he was given instructions by a Dr. J.R. Maxfield from Texas, who was also involved in the classified anti-gravity programs that Edward Teller was involved with, that Maxfield and Teller and Deo were part of this kind of anti-gravity research study group that Deo was kind of a part of. And he was told to continue the research at the Aeronautical Research Laboratory in Fisherman's Bend in Australia, in Melbourne. And so he was told to go to the Australian consulate in San Francisco and just to contact a particular person and basically say that he was part of Maxwell's party. And Maxwell, of course, was part of this anti-gravity research group in the US. So Deo supplied 2 letters that had been written by Maxwell that were basically recommending Deo as someone with competence in, you know, what he euphemistically referred to as an area of interest that Maxfield and Teller had, and that this would be someone that could help the Aeronautical Research Laboratory in their own work in this area. So very clearly what was happening with these letters was that the anti-gravity research group in the United States, involving Teller and Maxwell, were recommending Deo to go to Australia to basically work with the Australian research program on anti-gravity. Now, of course, Deo was, you know, an FBI agent, and, you know, all sorts of questions. Well, was Deo an American spy to kind of like come in and find out what the Australians are up to with their portion of the secret space program. It raises that question. But nevertheless, Deo says that when he was down there in Melbourne, that he was that he spoke with Dr. Tom Keeble, who was head of the mechanical engineering department at the ARL, who was very knowledgeable about anti-gravity designs. And here's a diagram of a functional anti-gravity craft Deo said that he saw at the Australian Research Laboratory in Melbourne. And this is back in 1971. So, and there's the design, and we can kind of recognise, you know, by the ring, that this is something designed to create an electrical field, magnetic fields that could maybe be used to guide plasma in a circular path, or use a kind of similar principle in some other anti-gravity design or prototype that was being developed in Australia. So here we have from Deo his own input into the Australian involvement into the anti-gravity research project. And there's another interesting Australian connection here, which is that the man that actually headed the Navy espionage program into Nazi Germany, that actually was getting Tompkins to create these briefing packets that would then inform aerospace companies and think tanks about Nazi aerospace programs developing anti-gravity. He was an Australian, born in Melbourne in 1890 and emigrated to the US in 1908 after having studied at the Melbourne School of Engineering. So clearly a very influential person in the development of the US secret space program, was probably either a former Australian citizen or even a dual citizen, a dual American US citizen at the time, Admiral Rico Boda. So I thought I'd play a few minutes of Deo talking about his involvement in this anti-gravity research. So let's see how we can do this now.
This scientist believes that man holds the secret of anti-gravity and can produce flying saucers at will. We interviewed him at a private house in Perth.
Well, originally I didn't start to investigate UFO phenomena. I suppose I started studying the physics that led me to this point, 62 to 64, at the United States Air Force Academy as a cadet, in a special government program. As you're aware, the Air Force Academy is outside NORAD in the Colorado Mountains. It's a few miles up the hill from it. And I was trained there with 180 some odd other characters to do research in areas of electrogravitics later. And we were programmed with libraries of information by slides flashed up on a wall at the rate of 200 pages a second. We couldn't even read them, but they were being implanted in our minds subliminally. It was a very classified project, and for the most part of it, while we were being programmed, we weren't aware of what was going on. We had normal classes in physics and calculus and this sort of things, but this stuff was being programmed in so that we had to assimilate it or bring it to our conscious mind over the months and years that followed in dreams and kind of daydream periods during the day when we were awake. But I left the academy in 64. I had a top secret security clearance with the government, and then eventually that lapsed to secret. And I did a bit of time in the reserves, Air Force Reserves, with the Strategic Air Command outside of Fort Worth. And then proceeded to do private research in this electrogravitics, thinking that I had cracked the secret of anti-gravity all by myself, and jumping up and down in my father's labs and mines in Dallas. And one day I was approached by the government and a kind of a emissary from Dr. Edward Teller's office, Dr. James R. Maxfield. And he told me what I'd been doing in my lab and the details of stuff I haven't even written down or told anybody. He knew, and he had other people like myself sponsored in this kind of research around the country. And that was the first time that I knew that the U.S. government was actively involved, had been and was still actively involved in the control of gravity with electricity.
And who did this man represent?
Well, his job, as his job qualification is he's the director of the James R. Maxfield Radiation Research Clinic in Dallas, Texas. The same Maxfield that invented the irradiated thread treatment for cancer of various organs. If you look at his little dossier that's in the Who's Who, you'll find that he was on the President's National Security Advisory Board, which is really a rather important log in the U.S. intelligence system. Kissinger would have been on the same rank. You find that he was closely affiliated with Dr. Edward Teller, who was the kind of dubbed the father of the hydrogen bomb project in the United States. But he told me that Dr. Teller was the head of antigravity research there, had been, I don't know whether he still is, and that he had worked on a similar project with him. In fact, the letter that you and I viewed earlier from my files from Dr. Maxfield to this government and to Sir John Williams did mention that fact, if you recall.
So what happened to you then?
Well, they suggested that I finish my research in Australia. I wasn't enthralled with the idea, but Dr. Maxfield told me that I would be paid to come down and that I was to call the Australian consulate in San Francisco and ask for Bob Gray and tell him that, in these words, that I was a member of Maxfield's party. That's when people here in this country at the Aeronautical Research Labs, politicians started to get a hold of me. ASIO contacted me. Good grief. An ad infinitum chain of intelligence people, including 2 CIA people from the States. And then the FBI eventually started looking for me in this country, and that again was after the intelligence war over there after Hoover died. And I was unable to finish my research in this country. In fact, I met many dead ends in government departments and research facilities where they told me privately, like Dr. Tom Keeble in the Aeronautical Research Labs. He told me, yes, we know about the flying saucers your countrymen have built in England and Canada. And in fact, we have film records of them here in the RAAF files. I said,
I want to stop you there.
Yeah.
Are you saying, Stan, that there are such things as, let's call them flying saucers, but they are built on Earth?
Yes. That doesn't mean that I rule out the possibility of other flying devices or intelligent beings visiting the planet either from the oceanic bottoms or deeper areas or from other areas in space. But I am positive that we have the technology, I can even name you the companies and people involved, in making high-speed electric aircraft that do look, strange enough, like a saucer.
Okay, so there you have Stan Deyo with his remarkable experiences where he was essentially part of an anti-gravity program in the United States and came to Australia to continue it, but ran into a lot of problems because of his security background. I don't think they fully trusted him here, and so he certainly had to go into hiding in Western Australia. But nevertheless, he has said and has provided documents substantiating Australia being involved in a secret space program. So that then raises the question, well, were a number of UFO sightings in Australia part of the Australian participation in this secret space program? Or was Australia testing its own prototypes that may have been mistaken as UFOs? So, let's see. Oops. Looks like my advance is not working. Let's do this. Oops. Okay, I think I can current slide. Yeah, I think now we're good. Oh, we're good. Okay, so that's the facility at Fisherman's Bend, where the Aeronautical Research Laboratory was based. So one case that I thought was possibly linked to this Australian participation in the flying saucer program was the Westall case from 1966. You notice the proximity to 2 areas where a prototype could have been tested, the Fisherman's Bend and the RAAF base at Point Cook. relatively close over Port Phillip Bay, a body of water, offering a certain degree of kind of security for testing this kind of vehicle. One of the clues, the telltale clues, I think, that this Westall incident was related to a classified flying saucer program was the Project Highball was actually linked or coincided with the testing or with this vehicle being seen and that landed at Westall. On April 5, 1966, there was a test of this Project Highball high altitude balloon that was launched from Mildura. Now, the researcher, the Australian researcher, Keith Basterfield, in his opinion, he thinks that Highball may explain the Westall case. Now, I think there's a lot of people that are very clear about what they saw and that this was in no way a weather balloon. But one of the things I found interesting was that Basterfield, when he was covering this Project Highball, he said that the record was missing for this particular flight, 292. Even though it was scheduled for April 5, it could have occurred on April 6. Now, the significance of April 6, of course, is that that's when the Westall incident occurred. So if they weren't the same, incident, so how come they coincided? Well, I think the explanation is probably something along the lines of this, that Project Highball was the cover program, to hide the more classified program, which is the Australian Flying Saucer program. So I think something like that was occurring. Of course, this is an NSA file, and the NSA works with its Australian component. I think, what is it? The Australian Security Intelligence Service, something like that. But anyway, they share the same philosophy and the same approach to conducting classified programs. So this is how they do it in the US. This is how they've been doing it in Australia, which to my mind gives a plausible explanation for what Project Highball was, that it really was a classified program to hide a more classified flying saucer program. So, this gets me to the final parts of the presentation now. So, how come this information is coming forward now? Why now, of all times? Why are we suddenly witnessing different whistleblowers revealing this? According to Randy Kramer, who says that he worked for a special section of the US Marine Corps, he says that he was told or authorized by his superiors. He refers to a colonel and a brigadier general, Marine officers, that he was authorized to come forward and reveal what he knew. That there are people now, senior officers in the military, who are authorizing these whistleblowers to reveal what they know. So certainly this is what Randy Kramer says is why he came forward, because he was told to. He was authorized to do this. Corey Good has also been authorized. He has been working with this Secret Space Program Alliance, and tomorrow I'll actually go into detail in terms of Corey's involvement in the Secret Space Program Alliance, the different meetings that have occurred, the negotiations that have been conducted, and what's happening most recently in terms of those negotiations and agreements, and what likelihood or what we're likely to witness in the near future. But certainly Corey says that he's been authorised to come forward because he's working with the Secret Space Program Alliance, which basically comprises the Solar Warden program that was created by the Navy and defectors from other secret space programs that I'll describe tomorrow. But for those of you that have read the Corey Good material, you know about those various space programs that have been set up, including the Nazi program out of Antarctica, where you actually have people defecting because of recent developments involving highly evolved extraterrestrial races coming into our sector of the solar system, the sphere being alliance, as Corey describes it. That this has kind of led to our solar system being quarantined, and different space programs with a kind of galactic component, such as the Nazi program, or what Corey describes as the Dark Fleet, they were cut off and people or personnel defected. And so they became part of this secret space program alliance. And Corey has been authorized to reveal a lot of this information. Bill Tompkins, on the back of his book, he actually refers to a conversation he had with Admiral Hugh Webster, who after retirement became the director, the corporate director of a UN Navy affiliated organisation called the Navy League. And he was, in 2001, Bill Tompkins went to him and said, look, you know, these are the experiences that I had. How much of this can I reveal to the world? And Admiral Webster said, Bill, tell it all. This is most important to our country. Don't leave anything out. So Bill Tompkins has been authorised to come forward. Another very recent development, only the last couple of months really, is Tom DeLonge, who is very well known. How many of you know of Tom DeLonge and Blink 182? Okay, well, there's a few of you. Well, Blink 182 was a very successful rock band. It still continues today, but Tom DeLonge is no longer the lead vocalist, or one of the lead vocalists in that band. They sold, I think, close to 30 million albums, so clearly a very popular group. But Tom DeLonge became committed to this topic of UFOs and secret space programs, and so he decided that he would dedicate himself to finding out more and revealing the truth. He says that recently he came into contact with groups of very senior corporate officials and military officials, a general, who gave him a lot of information about the secret space program run out of Area 51. And that Tompkins co-authored a book, a fiction based on fact book called Secret Machines, Chasing Shadows, which is really a kind of soft disclosure of the secret space program run out of Area 51. And basically it describes some of the history that Tompkins was told by his 10 advisors about how this secret space program developed, the connection to Nazi Germany, and how it has been developed out of Area 51 involving the TR-3B. So according to Tompkins in this book, the TR-3B is the most advanced aerospace program known to exist. Now, certainly, as far as Area 51 is concerned, he's absolutely correct. People that work at Area 51 regard the TR-3B as being close to, if not the most advanced spacecraft that's been built by the US. But as we know from what Tompkins and Good has said, there's another program run by the Navy. But nevertheless, I think DeLonge's information is noteworthy, because he's been earmarked by high-level people in the military-industrial complex to reveal this information to the world's youth. I guess he's got a profile, a background that may be is something that's going to get a lot of attention and a lot of trust. And so I think this is something that we are going to see in the very near future, kind of moving forward in a very dramatic way, when the non-fiction book comes out, where supposedly a lot of documentation is going to be released. And that can happen any day. I don't know. He hasn't said anything about the schedule, but I think the next volume of this Secret Machines kind of multimedia project that DeLonge has envisaged is going to be a non-fiction book with a lot of documentation about the program run out of Area 51. And when that comes out, that's likely to get a lot of media attention, and we might see things like the Sydney Morning Herald, the Huffington Post, the New York Times, all of the major media grabbing onto DeLong's information and just kind of like, you're going to get a media blitz about that, and this being the real secret space program. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's not the full truth, but still it's a positive step because they're going to release a lot of very valuable information. So the workshop topics for tomorrow are going to go into more depth into the Nazi infiltration of the US military-industrial complex and sabotage, discuss the Solar Warden and other secret space programs that Corey Goode and others have discussed. The Kennedy assassination, that there's a very startling connection really to this whole phenomenon, the secret space programs, the link to the Nazis, and extraterrestrial life that the Kennedy assassination was involved in. There was an element related to that. Then meetings and negotiations to disclose these secret space programs and extraterrestrial life. That this is very recent information that we've been given from Corey Goode in particular about these meetings and negotiations, and I think they're quite startling in terms of the implications of this. And then we're going to be talking about contemporary global events that relate to this issue of extraterrestrial disclosures, secret space program disclosures, and especially in relationship to the BRICS alliance. And of course, the book is here, and I'm happy to do autographed copies. So we have, I think, about 20 minutes or so for questions. I'll be happy to take your questions. Yeah, please.
We've been talking the whole time.
Maybe I'll give you this and you can, yeah.
We've been talking the whole time, and it was a wonderful lecture, about virtually the American secret space program. But there was Avro in Canada that wasn't as hopeless as what they made out. But what do we know about the Russians and the Chinese? I mean, the Russians got up into space even before us. I can't believe that they haven't got something going as well, or have they actually been cooperating with the Americans as just one joint world effort, or do they have their own programs going as well? And if so, what are the implications of that?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, especially when it comes to Russia. I think they're a major player in this whole topic. They've been outside of these agreements that were reached between the US military-industrial complex with the German space program out of Antarctica and that alliance with the reptilians. And quite frankly, Russia's been helped by the Nordic space aliens. That's the behind the scenes, that's what's been happening, and the Russians have very quietly been developing their own fleet and have now reached the point where they have achieved parity with what the Solar Warden program and with what the Dark Fleet or the Nazi program has achieved. And so, yes, they're a very important player. China, I think, is playing catch-up to all of this. It's very interesting that in DeLong's book, The Secret Machines, Russia is presented as having as powerful a space program as the US, and that Russia is the big enemy, or at least Russia is a powerful foe. But DeLong actually kind of hints at another enemy that is not necessarily extraterrestrials, but kind of relates to ancient legends about gods and so forth, that he says that they are playing a kind of a role of manipulating both sides in conflicts. But definitely the Russians are very active with their own program. And there was a gentleman, Dr. Peter Beta, during the 1970s and early 80s, came out with a series of articles about the Russian cosmospheres. Again, I think that was something that they had built because they were being helped behind the scenes. I think someone else had a question. Oh, you want to follow up?
Do you think that could indicate possible cooperation or confrontation?
Well, this is one of the things that Corey Good discusses, that the Secret Space Program Alliance is working with another group called the Earth Alliance, and the Earth Alliance comprises the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And so there's, even though up until recently there has been competition between the US military-industrial complex and what the Russians have been doing, very recently there has been a sea change, and now this Secret Space Program Alliance, the Solar Warden program, the US Navy, are working more closely with the Russians. Because I think, when you look at the history of the US Navy's Solar Warden program, they developed a lot of technology because of this kind of agreement that existed between the reptilian Nazis with the US corporations, but the Navy was also being helped behind the scenes by these Nordic aliens, according to Tompkins.
Just curious as to what was in the deal for the reptilians, and secondly, where do you see the relationship, the partnership that was originally formed now in terms of the US's ownership and directorship of the Secret Space Program, as opposed to a separate group from the actual US government, in terms of, because there's various information alleging that in fact it's fairly distinct from the US government in terms of who controls and pulls the strings. Just interested in any change in the dynamics in those relationships that you're aware of in terms of the overall geopolitical direction in which you perceive that it's heading.
Okay. It's a very complex question because the US is definitely not monolithic when it comes to the development of these secret space programs. There are multiple programs in the United States. Tomorrow I'll be going into details into the 5 programs that we know from the Corey Good information that developed, and they involve the Navy's Solar Warden program. They involve a program run by the multinational corporations that have a global reach that created their own space program, and that they also have very advanced technologies to rival, or even they were more advanced than what the Solar Warden program had achieved. There are special access programs that are run by the different military agencies, such as the US Air Force and the NRO, that their programs are different to the Navy's programs. So they have different kind of orientation. So it's very complex. It's definitely not monolithic. As far as the agreements with the reptilians is concerned, that was something that is relevant because I mentioned the Dark Fleet, the kind of outgrowth of that Nazi German program in Antarctica, worked with the reptilians, and their goal was to establish a kind of mercenary fleet that could be used for this reptilian program for galactic conquest. So they weren't interested in conquest of the Earth at all. I think the Earth is kind of like pretty highly contested between different ET groups, and so one group just can't come in and ride roughshod and take it over, and so which is why they couldn't just come in and aid the Nazis and help them win the Second World War. But I think that they took, plan B for them was to, okay, you can't win militarily, you can win through stealth and subversion and covert infiltration. And I think that they've been able to do that and thereby establish a very powerful mercenary force that they use for conquest in deep space.
Thanks very much for today. for the benefit of those who may not be here tomorrow, can you just briefly sort of like, do these different organisations, do they think they're just going to keep it secret forever and ever? Are they going to include the bulk of humanity at some stage with a new sort of grown-up attitude towards international relations and cooperation?
Well, I think there are those that do want to keep it a secret for another 100 years. I mean, definitely there are those called the Cabal, the Illuminati, those that believe humanity kind of not worthy of knowing this kind of information. They want to keep it secret, and I think that they're doing so because they see humanity as really being able to be kind of milked and creating a resource, a tremendous resource pool for personnel and technologies that can be used for these programs without kind of giving too much back. But yeah, but I think the thing is that there are others who are very opposed to that secrecy policy now. And I think in particular that the reason that the Navy, the US Navy, is opposed to this and has become very active in supporting whistleblowers in coming forward and helping organisations like this Earth Alliance or other countries that are wanting to get the information out, is that the Navy understands that if the plan moves forward for creating a world government with a world military, that over nearly 250 years of Navy history would be extinguished. And so they don't want that.
The underground caverns that the Nazis found or were led to, were these the caverns in the so-called hollow earth?
Yeah. That's another very interesting question. It's becoming very clear that the whole hollow earth theory is not quite accurate, that while there are large areas in the Earth's interior that are open, it's not so much that you have like a central sun, it's more like a honeycomb Earth, that the Earth is like a honeycomb with huge caverns, some as large as states, like even places like Queensland or something as big as that, that you can have those size caverns, and that they go down several hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles, and that the estimate is that there are millions of these caverns throughout the planet, and that these caverns can be used by civilizations going back hundreds of thousands or millions of years even, and by different ET groups. So certainly there is a lot there to kind of be better understood as we get more information.
Just a quick question, because you're really talking about World War II and all the different spacecraft and various different countries involved in it. How do you see, or how do you explain the funding for all these things? Because Australia, for instance, is getting a few subs and they're $50 billion. Now, to actually leave outer space, you're talking about something that's going to cost significantly more, and to have different countries have those sort of budgets would be a massive drain on any world economy. And second part of that question is, what's supposed to be the end game of having all these different space programs going from different countries? It seems like they've got competing forces for what?
Well, the funding is a very important part of this. One of the things that happened during the Second World War in 1944 in a town in France called Strasbourg, Martin Bormann had organised for German industrialists to meet together to basically take all of their capital out of Germany and take it to safe locations so that after the war they could rebuild the Third Reich. It would be a Fourth Reich. That was the plan. And so this was something that began then, taking lots of gold and precious metals and resources that would be used after the war for developing a secret space program that the Nazis had already established in Antarctica. This is something that the US replicated with the creation of the CIA. In 1949, it's called the CIA Act, which basically singled out the CIA as the only government agency that could basically send funds or have funds channeled to whatever projects without any kind of congressional oversight. So the CIA, since its creation, was basically playing the role of the bagman, if you like, for the US secret space programs. It would be the CIA that would be involved in things such as the drug trade, Wall Street manipulation, white-collar crime. These were things that the CIA did, and how much money was raised. Well, you get an idea from 1988, 1989, and 1987 as well. 3 years in a row, President Clinton had mandated, made orders that the Defense Department gets audited. And so the Inspector General of the Department of Defense basically found that in those 3 years, $1.7 trillion was unaccountable for each of those years. What that basically meant that was huge amounts of money were being laundered through the Department of Defense, and they couldn't account for where it was coming and going and so forth. Now, at the time, the budget of the Pentagon was around $300 billion. And here you're talking about 1.7 trillion, so 5 times the budget of the Pentagon was being siphoned for whatever purpose. And so I think that gives us an idea of how this secret space program was funded. I don't know if there was a second part of the question I missed.
I was just saying that if you've got all different countries, like say Russia, what would be the end game of having so many different things?
Okay, well, what's the end game of all these countries having so many different ends? Well, I think it's just geopolitics. It's just the Russians didn't trust the Nazis, and the Nazis had more in common with American industrialists than with Soviet communists. And so they made the deals with the Americans because they knew that the Nazis would fight to the bitter death, that the Soviets would fight to the bitter death, rather than kind of accommodate these Nazis. And so there have been different programs there, or different agendas there. And then within the US as well, the Navy had a different agenda to, say, the industrial elite, the corporate leaders that signed on to these Nazi programs. Say the leaders of major corporations that were probably happy to develop these advanced craft for the Nazis or for the highest bidder. So I think there are multiple agendas.
I'll go to the back.
Thank you, Michael. A fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. I had a very simple question. This secret Nazi Fourth Reich basis in Antarctica, it's supposed to have been there since, I guess, Second World War. Do people ever come and go from there, and how is it replenished? Are there any details on, these people surely since then must have had a change of personnel. Is there any kind of information on how they do that?
Okay. Okay, well, what's going on in Antarctica? One of the things that is emerging is that Antarctica is linked through these massive underground caverns with the rest of the Americas, and that large amounts of equipment and personnel can move back and forth, as well as with the different space programs that can actually access the locations in Antarctica, which are still being used as part of the one of these space programs called the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, that they actually set up facilities in Antarctica to build craft and to be able to service their own space program and the program of the Nazis and the German Dark Fleet. So in Antarctica, a lot of the facilities there have been in operation since the Second World War to kind of service, what we would consider to be kind of like more service to self type groups. That is kind of more space programs that are regressive, not highly ethically evolved at all. Whereas what is happening elsewhere, whether it's with the Navy's programs or what's happening in Russia, these seem to be where more positive agendas are unfolding.
Michael, thank you very much for your talk. It's been really interesting and informative. Can you comment on COBRA's work on revealing information about what he calls the event? Because I think all of what you're talking about has, kind of culminates in something that quite a number of UFO researchers are looking into now.
Wow, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Nice sprinting. Well, I will be discussing that tomorrow, the event and what that involves. But very, very briefly, we are entering into a area of the galaxy where a number of sources say that there are high energy particles that are going to impact on the sun and impact on the human DNA and kind of accelerate us to the point where either we are able to integrate these energies so that we can kind of manifest a more harmonious world, or we are going to implode in some way. And that might not happen globally, it might happen in different regions. So some places might implode, whereas other places might achieve incredible kind of abundance, and where people are able to kind of collectively manifest something very beautiful. So the event, as these people are describing, is something that doesn't have to be kind of just one single phenomenon for the whole planet. It can be happening in different ways for different parts of the planet. But certainly it seems to be a transition, and I think that the disclosure process is a way of preparing people for even these bigger changes that are kind of coming down the pike or coming down the highway.
With the obvious advanced technology, was there any plans for that to actually be given to universities or scientific communities so we can actually use it, instead of just being sitting in the military and basically not being able to be used or advanced anybody else?
Well, actually, I think that is something we can be very optimistic about, that some of these technologies are going to be released very, very shortly. I think this is something that Tom DeLonge has been getting from his advisors, and certainly William Tompkins is still active in a way that he hasn't publicly revealed yet in some of these programs. And what he has been saying is that within 2 years, for example, some of these age regression technologies are going to be released. And I think it's a kind of, as well as many other technologies associated with these kind of like what I referred to earlier in terms of what's happening out of Area 51 with the TR-3B. That's kind of like older technology now, but still it'll revolutionize our planet You know, the things that are happening at Area 51, as those things are released, as I think they will be, and we're probably talking, you know, within 1 to 2 years, a lot of these things being, documents being released, and then scientists being allowed to pursue these projects. I know, for example, aerospace companies like Boeing have been, for many years now, asking for permission to start releasing kind of anti-gravity aircraft. But the Boeing Corporation has been denied. But Boeing is very much involved in that, and they would love nothing better than to replace all of the current world aircraft by new generations of anti-gravity Boeing craft that could be used for commercial airlines and probably even flights into outer space. So I think what is going to be happening as these technologies are released is we're going to have a revolution in the transportation industry, and you know, things like the automotive industry will be revolutionised as well as they come up with, say, free energy engines, so that you can have cars that travel for hundreds of miles on a single charge, and even flying cars. I think these are the things that we're probably going to be witnessing. We are going to, I think, you can be pretty confident we're going to have a transportation revolution very similar to the communications revolution. The Keshe Foundation, I don't know. I know people are very divided on that, but I think as these documents are released and people are allowed to come forward to talk about these technologies, I think that's when a lot of the universities are going to be encouraged to kind of do studies on these, and a lot of the corporations will be able to kind of churn out some of these new products.
Just related to that, with the Richard Branson and SpaceX and all of them talking about what they're doing, is that all a bit of a con? Like, are these guys with all this money not aware that there's better technology out there? Can you comment on that?
Thank you. I think they're aware that there's stuff out there that's more developed and more advanced, but they're also aware that as long as it remains classified, then they're not going to have any chance of developing it. So better use the conventional technologies that are available now and try and tweak that and develop that as far as possible, and hope that the classification system is relaxed, or that in some way some of these technologies can kind of percolate up into the white world, so that people like Elon Musk and Richard Branson can use it for their space programs.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I guess this is, I don't know if this is a question, but it's definitely seeking corroboration of something. I've had the opportunity to witness lots of unknown aerial phenomena over the years, since about the age of 10 up until recently. Mainly lights in the sky, distant lights in the sky. But around 2008, 2009, there was a sighting of a cigar-shaped mothership in Western Sydney, which I witnessed one afternoon. I don't know how no one else saw it, but it was there, it was life. Also, a number of years after that, linking to this other sighting, there was a period where for some reason I was compelled to be watching the skies at 3 or 4 in the morning. And 2 nights in a row, I saw these very high-flying aircraft, or what I assume was aircraft. They were very high, but they had lights, a lighting array, unlike any other kind of commercial or military planes. They had a red light on each, what I assume was a wingtip, and on the back there was like a wide orange strip of light. And they were travelling from the northwest down to the southeast. I know they were very high because when they disappeared out of view, when the light faded out to nothing, they were still very high above the horizon. As most people in Sydney know, there's a military base in Richmond in the northwest. I guess what I'm seeking is corroboration in that, like, with your experience with secret space programs, is what I witnessed something that's common to that? Have other people seen a similar thing? Or did I just see something that's totally explainable and normal?
I think a lot of UFO sightings are probably related to some of these secret space programs that have bases in different countries. Australia, as we heard, is a part of this, and so it stands to reason that some of these sightings are related to Australia's participation in the secret space programs. So, whether it's the RAAF or the Royal Australian Navy, one or both of these organisations is probably involved in some of this. Also, we can't discount that there also are extraterrestrial visitors that are here that want to reveal themselves, to raise consciousness, and I think it does raise consciousness. When you have lots of UFO sightings or crop circles, this is something that gets people's attention, gets the media's attention, and it helps raise consciousness. And I think this is something that some of the ET groups want. And so they allow themselves to kind of like be seen. So it could be any number of those. But I don't think it's necessarily just kind of something untrivial. It could be very important.
I was just wondering if you had any information regarding New Zealand's role in a lot of the things that you've been talking about, if you have any just general information.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say New Zealand is probably very much involved in this as well. I mean, they're part of the Echelon Group, and if Australia is involved, then New Zealand is probably providing some of its own resources. And I don't know too much about how New Zealand would have materially interacted or provided personnel or resources to this program. We're still waiting for whistleblowers to maybe tell us a little bit about what New Zealand has been doing. I know there has been an abductee, or several people that have written books about abductions in New Zealand, and they've talked about that aspect of it. But yeah, I don't know too much about the secret space program in New Zealand, but I would suspect it's probably very significant.
Anyone else? Probably one more question after this one, and then we'll finish.
Just getting back to disclosure, I'm just wondering, because I listened to David Wilcock and he talks about partial timeline disclosure and the full disclosure. So in your research, can you comment basically on what you see coming? Is it just the partial drip feeding of partial disclosure, or are they trying to lead up to revealing everything?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important question, and I really recommend, if you haven't done so, maybe take a look at Tom DeLonge's book, Secret Machines, because I think that is a partial disclosure narrative that's going to be sold. There's an attempt to sell that to the world public. And I think it's a very interesting narrative, and the question is going to be, as that is rolled out, whether people are going to be satisfied with that kind of level of disclosure, or whether they're going to want more. Personally, I think that once you start to disclose some of this, you can't stop full disclosure from happening, because then all of a sudden people will kind of like look more seriously at the information that Corey, Bill Tompkins, David Wilcock, myself have been releasing. But I don't underestimate the capacity of the elite to kind of manage public perceptions and sell something like a partial disclosure narrative. And I think Tom DeLonge's book is part of that, even though I think he's probably very sincere in what he does, but he's definitely being fed a partial disclosure narrative. Last one.
Last question.
just a quick one. You know how we call some races extraterrestrial races? Would Earth actually be their home, like in what we call an ET? Would these caverns actually be their home?
Well, I think at that point we're probably talking about intraterrestrials, that is, groups that have had a presence on Earth for hundreds, thousands, even millions of years. And you know, there are some groups that actually do say that they have been on Earth for millions of years and are part of the kind of pure bloodline of Earth, and that we, on the surface of the world, of the Earth, are extraterrestrial hybrids. That the real Earthlings are in the subterranean regions in these civilizations, and we're the hybrids. You know, we have been genetically interfered with for hundreds of thousands of years. So in that kind of scenario, then it's really just identifying which ET groups have interacted with which racial groups. And I think there are kind of several racial groups on the planet that probably would relate more to one or more ET groups than, say, another racial subgroup. So I think, and yeah, Alex Collier has written about that, and I think Corey's Goods Information also talks about 22 different extraterrestrial genetic experiments. But yeah, I think we are kind of very mixed in our genetics, and you know, the whole idea of a hybrid human extraterrestrial race is probably something that is part of our history going back hundreds of thousands of years.
On that amazing note, please give him a big hand.
Thank you.